Hello and welcome to the top 100 retro consoles, or every retro console ever, ranked. If I'd realised this video would take 2 years to make, then I'm not sure I would have even started. So I'm going to ramble a little about methodology and definitions and such first, so if you're not that fussed about all that stuff, then there should be a marker on the video to jump straight to the list. Okay, for anyone who's still here, the list contains retro consoles, where retro is defined as more than 2 generations ago and having a release date more than a decade ago. I'm sure there'll be a lot of disagreement with that definition, and with me including the PS3 and 360 in this list. But to be honest, having 2010 as a cut-off point just seemed like a nice round number to use, so don't put too much thought into it. Just think of this as a list of consoles from the beginning of gaming until 2010. The placings are based purely on my opinion, not sales figures or the like. The list includes first generation consoles, but only when there's something notable about them. There were literally hundreds of consoles during the beginning of gaming, and 95% of them effectively played the same set of Pong variations. The list does not include plug-and-play consoles. I'm defining these types of consoles as machines where all of the games came included in the consoles themselves as standard, and there was no intention from the console's producer to release more titles later. Obviously there's an exemption where the first generation consoles are concerned though, as interchangeable games were barely a thing back then. Backwards compatibility will rarely, if ever, have any bearing on the list. The consoles are being rated based on their own achievements alone. So in regards to methodology, I rank the consoles based on the size of their software library, the variety in their software library, price, how innovative the hardware and software was, because no one wants to pay out for a new console and find it offers much the same as their old console, and overall hardware power. All consoles are rated in these areas based on the context of the times in which they were released. So for example, the Atari 2600 will score very high in hardware power, because in 1977 it was very impressive, even though it's ridiculously crude by today's standards. So with all that waffling out of the way, let's get onto the list. We've got a way to go, so let's move through the start with brevity. So starting out the list, we have my choice for the worst console ever made. The Storm Action was a motion-controlled Power Rangers themed console released by ToyQuest. Unsurprisingly, the console didn't do very well because, well, I mean, just look at the footage. It speaks for itself, really. The system had outdated graphics, a barely functioning control system, and only one cartridge was released for it too, though more were announced. Apparently it ended up being turned into a plug-and-play system later on, which is probably what it should have been from the start really. And the next console on the list is this absolutely terrible offering from Unisonic, a machine that was actually designed by the same company as the very much not terrible Intellivision, with this one aimed at the budget market. Unfortunately in this case the hardware design was completely botched, to the level that it probably should have never been released at all. The system was a mess and was very limited on what it could do. All it really had on it was electronic versions of board games and card games, unnotable stuff like Blackjack and Mastermind and the like. And that's not really even the worst of it, because the system does a terrible job of playing said games, due to its entire control method consisting of nothing but a yes button and a no button placed on the console itself. So you have to constantly wait for the machine to cycle through available options at every stage until the one that you want comes up so you can press the yes button to choose it. According to some of the console's paraphernalia, they intended to put other types of games on the system eventually too, simple things like tic-tac-toe and hangman, but these didn't come to pass and thankfully the system quietly died. Sad to say that one of the worst consoles of all time was made right here in the UK. The Bridge Companion was a system where literally all of the games were focused on learning and playing the card game of bridge and nothing else. Funnily enough, inside the console was a very popular and fairly capable graphics chip from Texas Instruments, the same one found in the ColecoVision. In fact, get ready to see this graphics chip appear a lot during the course of this list, as it was insanely prolific back in the day, due to being cheap to license and mass produce. Other than having a very limited library, the console was also extremely overpriced and a bit out of date. You have to wonder why its designer felt that Bridge required the creation of its own dedicated console, as opposed to just putting his programs on another console or computer, but one thing's for certain, he must have really loved Bridge. And after only just mentioning how common said Texas Instruments graphics chip was, here it is again, this time in a Japanese console that was focused on board games, including Japanese favourites like Mahjong and Hanafuda cards, as well as popular board games like Mastermind. Not a very versatile console, but at least it plays more than Bridge, and it came out a couple years earlier than the Bridge Companion to boot. This was an absolutely horrendous console made by Mattel, their first new console since the Intellivision nearly 30 years earlier. If this was all they had to offer, they should have stayed away for another 30 years. The gimmick here is that the system can scan cards, which of course are sold separately, and these cards give you access to more features for the games that are already included in the games, but of which you were blocked from actually using. The cards essentially give you more characters to use or special moves and such. So as you can guess, the main aim of this console was just to sell loads and loads of trading cards to children. Hardware wise it was similarly awful. The games are reminiscent of PS1 games from 10 years prior to its launch, and not good PS1 games either. The scanning is unreliable and the load times are some of the worst I've experienced on a console. They were slow and unremitting. Menu screens you navigate, characters you pick, stages you beat, all followed by a loading screen. Just an awful, poorly made, weak and cynical console all around. One of the most expensive consoles of all time, the Laseractive was a console that played laserdiscs. So as an aside, Laserdisc was a video format that existed prior to DVD. They were quite high quality but were huge record-sized things that couldn't hold much information. Unfortunately, playing games on this thing pretty much required you to also buy one of two expensive officially licensed add-ons, these slotted into the front of the machine. One of the add-ons added Mega Drive hardware and backwards compatibility, and the other added TurboGrafx hardware and backwards compatibility. However, both of these add-ons cost far more than it would cost to buy the original consoles, and all of this was added on top of the Laseractive itself, which cost like $1,000. If you had one of these add-ons, you could then buy one of the uniformly terrible Laseractive games that was specifically just for that add-on, and the console would combine the Laseractive's FMV graphics with the Mega Drive or TurboGrafx hardware handling the other gameplay elements. Being an incredibly expensive system with nothing but terrible games on it may not have been the be-all and end-all for the system had it been a phenomenal Laserdisc player, but apparently the system was not actually all that notable in the area of features or pricing as a Laserdisc player either. Just a very odd and ill-conceived machine. Now this one was a very expensive limited release system that had next to no software, just a handful of games, a handful of encyclopedia and educational software, and a handful of visual novels really. It was a multimedia type console that was essentially Tandy's answer to the CD, TV and CDI, both of which were also terrible and expensive. Just an awful console all in all. It really tried its best to live up to two other awful consoles, but failed. So this one was a UK made console aimed at young children. It was the latest in a long line of so-called edutainment consoles, where all of the games were videos that were either released on VHS or in the case of this console, DVD. These consoles would provide some limited interactivity with what was going on screen, with the child deciding which scenarios to watch, and answering questions being asked by the footage and such. With this particular one, the user had to input specific codes in order to sync it with their DVD player, as it had no inbuilt DVD functionality itself, and the games came with little notepads that slotted into the machine. This had all been done before, many times. The educational value of these types of machines has always been in question, and this particular one reportedly had problems syncing with many DVD players too. And here's the second one of these limited edutainment consoles. This one attached to a circle on the screen with a sort of plunger and read the flashes displayed on that part of the screen to receive data. The games, games in quotation marks there really, originally came on VHS but would swap to DVDs later on. Like the last console on the list, it's very limited, but this one was earlier and less temperamental. And this is the last of these three consoles. This one was shaped like an old phone and was probably the crudest of the three. The way that it worked was that the whole way through the video, the pre-recorded footage would play back every single response to what the player could possibly answer, one after the other in sequence, and the console would silence the audio for all but the relevant response. Unfortunately, this method means that the child would have to constantly sit waiting through silence. Whilst the crudest of the three, it's also by far the oldest and is likely the originator of the idea, hence I placed it ahead. This Japan-only console mainly focused on interactive movie-style games, which were a fad at the time. These were basically videos the console would play, and every now and then the player would have to correctly input button combinations or choose a branching path or such, often being forced to re-watch footage again and again until getting it right. Sort of like a system where the games are all just a series of quick-time events. Admittedly, there were exceptions. Some crude traditional games here and there, some dating sims and some educational software too, but the system's forte was with the FMV games. The only other notable thing about it was it had a wireless controller, which was rare at the time. It was an expensive system of limited entertainment value. And here's another bunch of consoles that use VHS tapes for games. With these ones the creators were trying to appeal to the more conventional gaming market though. This was a short-lived trend that occurred during the late 80s. I guess the thinking was that they could leapfrog the competition and provide photorealistic graphics right then and there. But of course this setup is really not suited to video games at all, due to an almost total lack of interactivity. The Action Max was one of these machines. It was focused on light gun games. You'd play the live action video on the television while shooting at the screen, and it would tally your score up on the console itself. It's as limited as it sounds. Nothing on screen would react to anything the player was doing, and it would always run through the same footage to the end regardless of how well you did. Frankly, Duck Hunt was better. This one was very similar to the last console, except this one is from Japan and most of the VHS games available are cartoon based as opposed to live action, with some being based on popular licenses like the Turtles and others being butchered ports of actual video games. The console itself also subtracted the number of times the player was shot from his score, so it was a little more advanced and interactive, but still pretty awful. So this was a little known VHS console from Sega, where a model car controlled by the player moves back and forth on a rail in front of their TV, whilst the footage of someone else driving through the streets plays on the television. At the bottom of the screen is a white bar that moves around, and the little car has a sensor on it checking when it's in front of the white bar. When it is, the console registers a crash and decreases your score. It's all kind of surreal really. Like all of these VHS consoles, the novelty wears off pretty fast, but at least it's a step up from the light gun machines. The final and possibly most interesting of the 4 VHS consoles of the third generation. Unlike the previous 3, this actually had some proper console hardware and a clever idea backing it up. The console can overlay graphics on top of the video whilst it's being played, and could also silence one or the other of 2 audio tracks from the VHS. So the creators could effectively shoot a video with multiple scenarios presented in split screen, and after the player chose a scenario, they could obscure the unchosen footage and silence its corresponding audio. Other than that, they can place a cursor and other interactive elements on top of the footage for other tasks, and there were even some full-screen overlaid sections with conventional gameplay, though these really do serve to highlight just how out of date the hardware itself was. A clever idea, but still quite limited, and this one was expensive too. It took me a while to decide whether to include this one. So basically this is a console mainly focused around drawing and dress up the character style programs, as well as music maker utilities and such. The main draw was that it could print out stickers, so you design your character or do a piece of art or some such and then print out stickers of your design. It did however have at least one actual game called Bow Wow Puppy Adventure, so I decided it was a borderline case. Anyway, it was really little more than an expensive novelty and there wasn't that much software. And here we have another set of educational consoles, but these ones were much more like regular gaming consoles. I debated with myself endlessly on whether to include these so-called edutainment consoles in the list or not. Are they really video game consoles, or are they something different? In the end I included them simply because I felt that their absence would be noticed and mentioned if left out. To be honest, these systems, especially the type within this bracket, always did have a number of actual games made for them anyway, and it's not like they're that numerous either, so why not just chuck them in two and create a new category for them. I'm going to be honest here though, I don't really have a very high opinion of any of these machines. Really I just see them primarily as a case of new money for old rope. Most of them were using hardware that was crazy out of date, and the libraries were often limited to just basic maths and spelling games, the types of games which have always existed on consoles since the very beginning. If you wanted to buy an NES and just purchase nothing but Donkey Kong Jr. Math and Sesame Street games, then you would essentially have a so-called edutainment console. Anyway, this particular one was basically akin to a hamstrung Super Nintendo released 14 years too late. There were no gimmicks and the software library was small and unnotable. This one is the successor to the last console. It came out only 2 years after the V-Smile, but is more akin to a hamstrung PS1 era console than the Super NES, so I guess they were making some progress at least. The system had around 10 games released for it. Funnily enough, the Nintendo Wii, which was available at the same time, actually had about 40 or 50 more edutainment games on it than the V-Flash did. So this is the sort of console you could imagine Homer Simpson would design for his brother. It had an unwieldy handle controller attached to the console itself that I can only think to compare to the control method you get in trains. The machine was really out of date for the time, coming out after the NES in Japan, but with games that struggled to even compete with the Atari 2600. And having your controller be part of the console had gone out of fashion 6 years previously. The software library was also tiny, with only something like 6 games released. Just a weird oddity really. The Soundicvision was an obscure console from Hong Kong made by a company called Soundic. This was a successor hardware to their programmable TV game series of budget consoles, often referred to as PC50X consoles these days. Soundic would design and sell these machines themselves, but would also lease out the design to other companies who would produce their own versions. The Soundicvision and its clones, however, never caught on in Europe in the same way as their predecessors. The hardware was just too outdated by this stage. As an aside, these machines are quite difficult to classify into generations for reasons I'll try to cover here. So in the beginning, consoles could generally only play one game, Pong. There were exceptions, but I want to keep this simple. Then, later on in the first gen, machines would arrive that had specialised chips in them designed to play specific games. One console would play nothing but Tank Combat, for instance, whilst another nothing but Stunt Cycle. With the second generation came the idea of putting CPUs into the consoles that could read data from a cartridge, so a manufacturer could make a variety of different games for the system over time. Now Soundic, as well as Coleco, came up with a very different idea for their PC50X and Telstar arcade consoles. They put all of the hardware into the cartridges instead of the console, so all of the chips that were previously running those dedicated consoles kinda ended up being turned into cartridges for these machines. The Soundicvision, as well as a few Japanese systems, went one step further though. They actually put a CPU in every cartridge plus the game data, bringing them closer in line with the second generation systems. Anyway, that's enough history, let's get back to the list. Yet another VTech console on the list, the Socrates would be their first foray into the so-called edutainment market, which they would stick with for their next two consoles, the V-Smile and V-Flash. Like the consoles that followed, the Socrates was a fairly limited machine by the standards of the day. It was colourful but quite slow and had somewhat basic games, things like word searches and maze games and the like, but at least here I think VTech did try to do a little more with the console. The Socrates had a friendly robot mascot who would help with the games, who was kind of like the NES's Rob the Robot or Johnny Five from Short Circuit, which was a nice touch. The controller was wireless, and there are a bunch of different accessories too, such as a touch tablet for art and a voice module that allowed the console to talk to its young owner, probably the most unique of the VTech edutainment machines. Have you ever found yourself wishing that instead of being a blue hedgehog, Sonic had been a poorly drawn kid with a baseball bat instead? Well, I've got the console for you. This Taiwanese system, clearly modelled on the US version of the Super Nintendo and its control pad, came out in 1995. It was underpowered for the time, being completely crushed by the earlier PS1 Saturn and even Jaguar, and it wasn't particularly cheap either. And there were only about 12 games made for it, none of which were particularly unique or original. The machine lost a lot of money for its manufacturer and was quickly discontinued. This was a British console made by the company Amstrad, who had had some success in Western Europe with their 8-bit computer line. The console was based on a new design which upgraded the earlier computer design with hardware sprites and better scrolling and audio support. This tech was launched in both the new Amstrad Plus computer range and the GX4000 console concurrently in 1990. Unfortunately, the GX4000 was an incredibly poorly thought out product. Amstrad had decided to attempt to jump on the 8-bit console bandwagon far too late. They were chiefly aiming to compete with the Sega Master System at a time when the Mega Drive was about to be launched here. Even as a budget machine, it really didn't work out either. Whilst it was a new console being sold in the same price bracket as the Master System, the hardware actually still had trade-offs with the now 5-year-old console anyway, and the Master System had had years to grow its software library to a significant size. Even if all of these disadvantages didn't exist, the GX4000 still would have struggled though, as the software support for the machine was very lackluster. There was almost no worthwhile games on it at all, with most of them being rushed ports of titles from the old Amstrad computers, which used none or very few of the new hardware features. These games were completely inadequate by the standards of 1990. Nowadays, most of the more decentish games cost a fortune, and even then some of those games, like Switchblade, seem to have been released in a partially unfinished state. Amstrad totally misjudged the market, and the console really was doomed from the start. We didn't even get to see what the weak hardware could do. Thankfully this at least is being somewhat rectified now, as recently there's been an announcement that someone is porting the Game Gear Sonic the Hedgehog games to the system, and it's been great to see more of what the system's games would have optimally looked like. 8 years after the popular Commodore 64 computer had been released, it was someone's bright idea to repurpose it and sell it as a new cartridge-based console in 1990, which was the same year the Mega Drive hit Britain. By this stage the machine was woefully inadequate, being weaker even than the NES in many aspects. At least, you may say, it had access to a big oven-ready library of computer games. No, this actually had quite low compatibility with the computer. Heck, it somehow managed to have low compatibility with its own dedicated software at times, with some asking the player to press T to start, on a console with no keyboard. Unsurprisingly, the machine died with little fanfare. At least some third parties did put out compilation carts of some of their classics, with the 3D title Stunt Car Racer still managing to retain a little of its impressiveness, even in 1990, so there was still a very small measure of fun to be had with the system. Now what we have here is pretty much the Magnavox Odyssey 3 in all but name. This was never released outside of Europe, where it was named the VideoPack G7400. This was because the Odyssey 2 was called the VideoPack G7000 here. The original Odyssey had actually been the first ever home console, and the second Odyssey, whilst completely dwarfed by the Atari 2600, had been a decent competitor, so I was interested to find out how the third one would stack up to its forebears. The answer was not very well. It's basically an Odyssey 2, except now with a new high-resolution background. As such, it did have full backwards compatibility with the Odyssey 2's library, and some of the games were even automatically enhanced when played on the G7400, with the additional high-res background now being used. Well, I say enhanced, but actually a lot of the time the new backgrounds were messy and made it harder to see what was going on. There were a few games made specifically for the hardware that would not run on the Odyssey 2, but unfortunately they were few and far between. We've seen a little bit more of what the hardware could do in recent times though, through the effort of homebrewers who have brought out new games for the Odyssey 2 that support the G7400 too, such as the Mage games which run with enhancements. All in all, a very half-assed and disappointing console, to be honest. VideoMaster Star Chess was a first-gen style console that was dedicated to just playing the eponymous game of Star Chess, and only in 2 players as well. You may think from the name that this is just chess, but you'd be wrong. It's perhaps more akin to dice-rolling tabletop war games, as there's a number of random elements to it that the console works out for the players. It's a deep enough game to keep the players interested in over a length of time, and I think the console itself has a great design, but really this was a bit too late and pricey for the first generation. Surprisingly, the game seems to have actually been ported to the Amazon Arcadia. A console that is somewhat notorious for being underpowered and outdated at launch, the Studio 2 was a black and white second generation console that was released shortly after the Fairchild Channel F, which had been in colour. As such, it was actually only the second ever machine that had used interchangeable ROM cartridges that allowed games to be swapped in and out, predating the 2600 by a few months. The console is admittedly quite bad. It's a crude machine with few games, and said games were still being controlled by a keypad on the machine itself, which was already a method that was being phased out by previous generation consoles. But I think it's perhaps not quite as bad as it's made out to be. It was at least quite a cheap machine in comparison to its competition, and while the hardware is poor, had it come out just a couple years earlier, it would have actually been pretty good, which is more than can be said for a lot of the other systems on this list. Even more unfortunate for the console's designers though, is that it possibly could have been released 2 years earlier, as reportedly by the time of release it had been sitting around for years. Initially RCA had designed it as an arcade machine in the mid-70s, but after testing poorly in focus groups, the idea had been scrapped. Then later, RCA had decided to repurpose it as a home console. Of course, by this time it had become outshined and outdated by competitors. There wasn't much software support for the machine, but of late we've started to see some homebrew interest during the last few years, with people putting games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders on it. So this console and its clone brothers are actually pretty much for all intents and purposes the RCA Studio 3. Basically this is just the same as the previous console on the list, but now with colour capabilities and sound that comes out of the TV speakers instead of the console itself. Essentially, after failing miserably with the RCA Studio 2, RCA went back to the drawing board and did a quick revision of their console's hardware to give it the much needed colour capabilities that had become standard by that stage. However, in the end they decided it was best not to release the hardware after all, and they cut their losses. The system ended up getting leased to a variety of different European and Japanese companies, where it was released in their territories under a variety of different names. Some of the models, such as the Visicom 100, had another much needed improvement in the form of separate controllers from the console, so users no longer had to sit with the Studio 3 on their lap to play games. Unfortunately most of the games are the same ones that were on the Studio 2, just with simple colour additions, but a few games did use the upgraded capabilities. This was a motion controlled console with an inbuilt camera that tracked the player's movement. It was basically a console version of the PS2's iToy peripheral, but released 2 years later and with only 7 games, most of which based on children's TV shows. I believe the iToy creators actually licensed out their tech, so this likely wasn't actually a clone but was more of an alternate application. Not a particularly noteworthy console, but it did have some novelty entertainment value. And another iToy style console from the same era. Apologies for the footage here, yep, that's me miming to a demo. Badly. Unfortunately this system is not properly emulated yet, and given the nature of the console I didn't feel comfortable asking other YouTubers to use their footage. Believe me though, as much as you're cringing right now watching it, I was cringing more making it. Anyway, this is very similar to the Ion. This one was marketed as more of a games machine though, while the Ion was marketed more for educational software, but honestly their libraries have a similar makeup of both. This one did however have a few more releases, and also dipped its toes a little into supporting Wii style motion controllers. All in all, it's not so bad. There are worse consoles out there. This console, as can be clearly seen just by looking at it, was a shameless Chinese knockoff of the then hugely popular Nintendo Wii. Basically, imagine the motion controls of the Wii, but in a much cruder and more limited fashion, paired with Super Nintendo-like graphics, and you've got a pretty good idea of what this console was like. Very, very limited by the standards of 2007. In fact, really it was limited by the standards of 1997. The console did take cartridges, and I believe 3 different ones existed. All were compilations. They contained remarkably unique games like Squirrel Bobble, and starred original characters like Totally Not Tiki from the New Zealand Story, and Totally Not That Guy from Man Overboard on the Mega Drive. The system also has these creepy, crudely drawn rabbit monsters as its mascots. You know what, I hate to say it, but I kinda like this console. It's so bad it's good. This one was an interesting budget console made by Qualcomm in conjunction with Tectoy, who are a Brazilian company that had had an unprecedented level of success bringing Sega's consoles to Brazil. The system was based on mobile phone tech, running a customised version of Brew, and was designed with developing countries in mind, where the people could not afford the latest gadgets. None of the games were physical, all were digital download only, and most looked only marginally better than PS1 games, and this was reportedly at a time when the PS2 could be bought in Brazil on the black market at a similar price range. In fact, the system actually had a bunch of PS1 era games on it, games like Ridge Racer, Tekken 2 and the Quake games, as it managed to get some major third-party companies supporting it. Even more surprising though is that the Zeebo got versions of Need for Speed Carbon and even Resident Evil 4. On top of these elements, the console also copied some things from the Wii. There was a motion controller and an avatar system similar to the Wii's Mii's, which were called Zeebos here. It's a somewhat interesting console due to its experimentation with digital download media, as well as having the odd obscure exclusive, including a remake of Double Dragon, but not a very good one due to its poor value for money and aging tech, even within the developing world it was designed for. This one was a dedicated trivia console where up to 8 players could compete. Each player had a wireless TV show like buzzer controller, and all of the different games you could buy separately had different trivia topics for them. It wasn't the worst idea for a console. I guess they were aiming for it to be a sort of party console for upper middle class wine drinkers or something, but unfortunately for Buzz Time it was made completely irrelevant by the subsequent release of Buzz on the PS2, a game which came with its own buzzer controller that provided largely the same experience. Actually, the makers of Buzz Time attempted to sue Sony, claiming they'd stolen their idea, but they were unsuccessful. To be fair, it's not completely outside the realms of possibility that the idea for Buzz came from this console, but it's not really a unique enough idea to lay claim to regardless. This Canadian console was kind of similar to the Buzz Time, but was more of a DVD multimedia console. It was also a little bit more upmarket and had a handful of conventional games on top of the trivia titles, bejeweled knockoffs and the like. One of the more famous titles was a party game called VeggieTales Veg Out Family Tournament, which was based on an apparently popular American franchise where cartoon vegetables and fruits tell Christian stories to children or something. Weird. It was a fairly inexpensive console, but had few games and didn't last long. On the upside though, it also happens to have one of the most hilariously cheesy infomercials out there, where a group of actors awkwardly pretend to be a family playing through some of the games. Check it out if you want some laughs. This console was literally just a PC in a console shell running Linux Fedora, and may have been some kind of investment scam. The company that made it had a history of announcing consoles which ended up becoming vaporware. This one however did seem to have a very limited production run. There are maybe a few hundred out there, so it's one of the rarest consoles on the list. A lot of the software was crude, simple download titles, but it reportedly could also run applications like the Wine emulator to decently play 5-year-old PC games at the time. A difficult system to rate as it's basically just an old PC in a fancy shell, so it's not without software, no personality though, and not an interesting or memorable console to play either. This was a gaming format where the hardware was licensed out to different tech manufacturers to be put in their DVD players to give them game playing functionality. It was sort of following on from the CDI and 3DO template from a decade earlier, with a dream of creating an all-in-one entertainment system for the home. They actually had some success getting big companies on board as well, with companies like Samsung and Toshiba backing it. On top of being a spiritual successor to the CDI, it was also related to the Jaguar. I mean, with a pedigree like that, how could it fail? Many of the same people worked on it, and there were sequels to some of the more popular Jaguar games, Iron Soldier and Tempest for example. It wasn't such a bad idea all in all, and apparently it made for a pretty good DVD player as well, with many enhanced functions, though some issues had to be fixed with a software update. Unfortunately for Nuon, the software support was even worse than the Jaguar though, and Sony managed to beat them to the punch and launched the PS2 first with its own DVD playing features. Yep, Apple made their own gaming console once, and it wasn't much good. The Pippin was a mid-90s console that went up against the N64 and PS1 that was based on Apple's Macintosh line of computers. The machine does actually have some interesting aspects. It was the first console to come with a modem as standard, predating the Dreamcast by a couple of years, and the joypads included a little trackball on them that worked as a sort of mouse substitute and made browsing the internet a smoother experience. Unfortunately, however, that's pretty much where the good points end. The system was arriving quite late to the market, and unlike the N64, which had also been late, the Pippin was very expensive. The modem was slow even for the time, and whilst the hardware wasn't weak per se, its strengths were not really that targeted towards gaming. Software support for the machine was also abysmal, with there being pretty much nothing of note on there apart from Marathon, a first-person shooter series ported from PC that was made by Bungie, who would go on to make the Halo games. Another failed console from Commodore. This one a consolised version of their excellent Amiga 500 computer, but now with an added CD-ROM drive included. Optional peripherals could also be purchased to essentially turn it into the aforementioned computer, giving it access to the 500's huge library of games. The system was promoted as an all-in-one multimedia centre, pitting it against Philips' failed CDI system, and similarly to that machine it also had an extortionately high price. The console stands up better than the previous C64 GS, but the price here is just too damn high for what it had to offer, and much like the C64 GS it was pretty much completely redundant anyway. You could just pick up an Amiga 500 for a third of the price. The CDI was a notorious multimedia console released by Philips that ended up competing against the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive and then carried on through the early 32-bit era. Now Philips, with Sony, had played a major part in standardising optical media formats during the 1980s, with music CDs, CD-ROMs and rewritable CDs being some important results of their work. In the mid-80s they decided to start work on the CDI, a home entertainment console that would be able to play a variety of different CD formats, such as games, music and movies. Unfortunately though, the machine went through a bunch of delays and as such was beaten to the punch by NEC with the release of the PC Engine CD in 1989. That was only one of the major problems though. The hardware was expensive, buggy and underpowered, and the tech to play movies was not quite ready yet at launch either, and as such ended up becoming an optional add-on for the console that you had to buy separately for the initial models. Some games actually also require this add-on to run. Talking about the games, the situation is dire to say the least. Philips decided early on that games would be a low priority for the CDI and didn't put a lot of effort into this area, only to find that gaming would be one of the main draws for this type of hardware. There's very little of interest on it, mostly just inferior ports of games from the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. Out of the exclusives, the most well known are the infamous officially licensed Zelda games, which came about due to an earlier deal with Nintendo where Philips had agreed to make a CD add-on for the SNES that ended up falling through, leaving Philips with the ability to make their own Nintendo licensed games, an advantage which they proceeded to squander. A lot of defence of this machine that you see around is focused around its multimedia aspects, but honestly an unupgraded CDI barely even has more functionality than the earlier TurboGrafx CD anyway, but at many times the price. And slightly later consoles like the 3DO and PS1 could do everything the CDI could. Perhaps the CDI wasn't supposed to primarily play games, but the other consoles weren't primarily supposed to be multimedia players, and they ended up being comparable to the CDI in that respect anyway. This was a console made by Fujitsu, which was effectively just a consolised version of their FM Towns computers. These were expensive, high-end machines sold mostly in Japan that had become somewhat famous among hardcore gamers worldwide for their superior ports of many arcade games. The Marty though wasn't released until 1993 and was based on the earlier models of the FM Towns machines, which were fast becoming superseded by newer, superior configurations by this stage. Out of all of these consolised computers, the Marty is actually one of the biggest pains, as its compatibility with the much better supported computer line is very problematic. Many games will run slow, will crash or will just not boot up at all. Be very wary of any info you see about this console online. Oftentimes videos and such will claim to be showing the Marty versions of games, but in fact will just be running on emulators set up with the specifications of the superior FM Towns computers. Hopefully I'm not adding to this misinformation myself in the montage. I've double checked all the games as actually working on the Marty, but mistakes do happen. All in all, it still did play some nice ports of some classic arcade games, but for 1993 it was just too little too late. People were starting to hear about the PS1 and Saturn by this stage. If anyone is interested in the FM towns, then I'd advise them to just buy one of the computers and avoid this console. It was frankly a bit of a mess and was shamefully overpriced at launch. The PCFX, which was released around the same time as the PS1 and Saturn, was NEC's successor to their TurboGrafx series of consoles. Given the excellence of the original TurboGrafx, the machine was a very disappointing successor to say the least, and ended up never even making it out of Japan. A lot of the console manufacturers during the mid-90s were really caught unawares by the 3D gaming revolution, and NEC was among them. They'd basically decided that FMV games like Microcosm and Silpheed were going to be where gaming was going in the near future, games which had you playing with 2D sprites over a streaming video background. As such, they decided to focus on making their new console a 2D and FMV powerhouse with no real polygon pushing ability, a hardware feature that had become largely indispensable by the time the PCFX was released. NEC had chosen to delay the system, making matters even worse, and even with all the hardware inadequacies it still managed to cost more than a PS1 and Saturn at launch. The PCFX didn't get a whole lot of software support either, and in fact reports say that they actually actively worked against companies putting less impressive 2D games on the system that didn't show off its FMV capabilities, such as the Bomberman games, as they felt they would make the console look bad and because they were aiming for an older demographic. There are a scant few okay, though not particularly groundbreaking 2D games on the system, but they are very few in number. So this was the first console release from what would arguably be the most important console manufacturer in history, Nintendo, and it's actually really quite mediocre to be honest. Just a generic machine that plays a few variations of Pong, and truth be told it's not even a particularly good or feature-rich representative for its time. These types of machines were a dime a dozen in the US and Europe in 1977. By this stage Americans actually already had second generation consoles that used ROM cartridges, and the release of the Atari 2600 itself was only a few months off. The colour TV game did however sell very well in Japan, as unlike the arcade game industry, which was absolutely massive there, the home console industry in Japan had developed at a much slower rate than in the US and Europe, and was still in its infancy, with many of the more state-of-the-art machines of the time just not being affordable to the average Japanese gamer. With the colour TV game, Nintendo had now created a cheap product that everyone could afford, and it was a resounding success there. Nintendo had kick-started the home console industry in Japan, and whilst things would still lag behind a bit for a while, this would eventually come to a stop as well, and it would be Nintendo again who would bring Japan bang up to date with the rest of the world, just 6 years later. The Supervision was a very expensive console released in Japan in the late 1970s. As was mentioned earlier, Japan was quite behind in the home console market at the time, and the consoles that were available there tended to be overpriced and under-supported. The Supervision is a good example of this. It wasn't a very impressive system and didn't have a whole lot of games on it either. What was there was fairly polished though, I guess. This was a somewhat generic console that went up against the Atari 2600 and Odyssey 2 that really didn't do much of anything to separate itself from the pack. The graphics aren't particularly great, and I'd say are often pretty ugly actually. There's very little software on the machine, being only a little over 10 releases in total, and what is there is almost totally unremarkable, just ports of the same types of games that were available on all of the systems of the time. A forgettable console, all in all. Another Japanese console released in 1983. 83 seems to really be a key year for new console releases there, with everyone attempting to capitalise on the burgeoning video game market in Japan at the time. This one doesn't have a lot going for it, truth be told, but it isn't one of the worst. The hardware is somewhat weak in comparison to what Sega and especially Nintendo were coming out with, and there's not a lot of games available, but it could be worse. The games are mainly just adequate ports of titles that were big in the arcades at the time, the sort of thing that was appearing on all of the consoles coming out in this era. They play reasonably well most of the time. There were only 13 titles released all in all, so as said, a very small library, and the console was reportedly only on the market for a few weeks before being pulled. This was the second of Sega's forays into the edutainment market, with the first being the original Sega Pico released some 12 years prior. The earlier Pico had been a respectable product for the time, with stylus and touchpad control, and games which all came with little books that would slot into a stand on the console. As the pages of the books were turned, the on-screen elements would change. This successor still had many of the same features, but whilst the hardware had been improved, it wasn't really reflected in the games, and the software library ended up being much smaller too. This was the predecessor of the earlier mentioned Beaner. Like that machine, it was an edutainment console with an interactive book element that was controlled with a stylus and touchpad on the console. The system was based on Sega's Mega Drive hardware, which was only just starting to go past its sell-by date at this stage, which to be honest made the Pico much more advanced than most of the other edutainment consoles were at release. There were quite a few games, including some Sega properties, and I think the book reading aspect of the machine made it quite unique and well suited to young children. Probably one of the better consoles of its type, though I guess that's not saying much. The CassetteVision was the first proper console with interchangeable games that took off in Japan, and was likely the most popular second generation console there. Previously it had just been Pong machines and other simple first generation systems that had gained mass market success in the country, with the more advanced systems being too expensive for the average Japanese gamer. But with the release of the CassetteVision this would change, and the Japanese would now have an affordable cartridge system that gave them access to simplified versions of the most popular games of the time, Pac-Man and Space Invaders and such. The CassetteVision was honestly still very underpowered for when it was released though, and it still isn't quite like the other second generation cartridge systems from the era either. This was actually another one of the Soundicvision type consoles where all the hardware was included in the cartridges themselves and not in the console, with every cartridge containing its own CPU and memory chips that held the game data. The games were controlled by dials, switches and buttons on top of the machine itself, which was also a bit closer in function to earlier first generation systems released in the West than the newer machines on the market at the time which had wired controllers. Still, it kind of still does an adequate job of playing popular games of the day, especially in the low price range. It's somewhat interesting due to the importance to the Japanese gaming market, and the games released were usually polished and made the most of the weak hardware. So the next set of consoles we have coming up, I actually prefer them to the subsequent set. So why then have I placed them lower? Well, the list is based on the context of the time. From the perspective of a retro gaming fan that isn't fussed about current trends, these consoles have much more interesting libraries of titles that you could actually spend time with, but from the perspective of the time in which they were released, they offered very little for the price they were asking for, and provided nothing that hadn't been seen before. Hence they're placed lower, even though I would rather own one now. This was a little known console made by Capcom that was mail order only. It was essentially Capcom's answer to the Neo Geo, which had been SNK's attempt to enter the home console market by consolising their arcade hardware, which already took cartridges anyway, and then selling it to the premium market as a luxury console. The CPS changer itself barely contains anything really, with all the hardware actually being included in the cartridges themselves. Kind of like with what had been done with some of the later first generation systems that were mentioned earlier. Essentially the CPS changer is just an adapter that fits onto Capcom's giant arcade cartridges and gives them a video output to attach them to a television through composite or S-video, as well as a port for the power supply, and two controller ports that are compatible with Super Nintendo controllers, including Capcom's own Super Nintendo arcade stick. Unfortunately for the system though, Capcom had released it woefully late. Whilst the Neo Geo console and its games were also eye-wateringly expensive, they were incredibly impressive. The Neo Geo was going up against the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive and blowing away what they could produce. The CPS changer on the other hand was around the release of the PS1 and Saturn. Now even if we ignore the fact that 3D gaming was where it was at by this stage, both of those consoles ended up being able to produce very nice ports of 2D games like Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter Alpha 3 anyway, and for significantly lower prices. There wasn't a whole lot of official releases for the system, with only something like 10 or 11 games total, but apparently you can kind of jury rig it to play a lot of Capcom's other arcade games without too much difficulty. All in all, this was just a massive waste of money, coming out far too late to be relevant. So the Zemix consoles were very obscure machines made by the big Korean electronics manufacturer Daewoo. They were effectively just consolised versions of the MSX line of computers. These were a series of Japanese computers that were a little more gaming focused than many of the other computers coming out of Japan at the time, and due to this they ended up having a pretty large library of games and a moderate effect on gaming history due to their support from major Japanese companies like Konami, HAL and Compile. For example, the MSX2, which this particular Zemix was based on, was where the Metal Gear and Alesta series originated, and the first Castlevania and Puyo Puyo games were originally developed for both MSX2 and NES simultaneously, whilst the earlier MSX computer had been where the Paradias and Adventures of Lolo series had first appeared. Anyway, essentially, after having some success bringing the computers to Korea, Daewoo turned their eyes to the console market and decided to just repurpose the MSX machines. Daewoo did well with the first Zemix console, so they released some minor revisions in the subsequent years, followed by this proper successor in 1990. Not only was this based on better hardware than the earlier ZMX, it was also reportedly more compatible, as it could be expanded into a full MSX2 computer if the owner purchased the necessary peripherals. So if it plays the games of the first ZMX and is more compatible than the first ZMX, then why have I placed it lower? Simply due to the release date. The original ZMX's hardware was essentially like that of the ColecoVision, except with a better sound chip, so it was only a few years behind the competition when it was released in 1985, and it still had games being produced for it for many years to come. On the other hand, this one is basically a Master System-esque console, being released when the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive were already available in Japan and the West, making it much further behind on the times, and its software lifespan was already starting to wind down even at the point of launch. Whilst the ZMX Super V was not really impressive at all for the time, this is exactly the sort of system which is really interesting to retro gamers due to its large library of games, including a plethora of key, beloved titles that never saw another console release at the time. Unfortunately, they are rarer than a hen's tooth though. This, I think, is going to be the first somewhat controversial placing on the list. The 7800 was a console designed by a company called General Computer Corporation. This company was known for designing a bootleg of Pac-Man that ended up actually becoming the game Ms. Pac-Man. Atari got hold of their 7800 design and were originally planning to release it in 1984 to compete with the ColecoVision, but due to the video game crash in the mid-80s it ended up being indefinitely shelved. Finally in 1986 Atari changed their mind and the system got its launch. Unfortunately, you can actually kind of tell this was the course of events just by looking at the early games for the system, as they were all about 2 years behind what the competition of the time were doing. In fact, the system's games were perpetually behind what was going on, with some ports of popular titles not arriving until 4 years after NES owners got them. Hardware-wise, it was also a mixed bag. There were a few minor strengths against the Master System and NES in some areas, but in others, such as audio, it was way behind. You may remember from the start of the video that I laid out one of my tests as being the question, were there any reasons to own this machine over a previous gen console? And the answer here is a resounding no. During the late 80s you'd be much better off getting a cheap second-hand ColecoVision than buying one of these. Sure, by the 90s a few slightly more advanced games started arriving for the system. Games like Scrapyard Dog and Midnight Mutants. But I'm going to be honest here, whilst these games are well liked by 7800 fans, I think they likely would have been panned if released on the NES or Master System. They really aren't noteworthy at all. All in all, I feel like the 7800 could very well be the most overrated console from a major company. Does the system get raved about? No, not particularly, though I do remember one console list where IGN made the delusional call to put it ahead of the Sega Master System, but it does however always seem to somehow evade lists of bad mainstream consoles, lists that are almost always populated by somewhat better machines. So here we have the Amazon Arcadia. Now this is actually just one of many versions of a hardware design that was originally developed by Philips. It's pretty much the successor hardware to an earlier console called the VC4000, a machine that had gained some limited popularity in Germany a few years prior. Essentially, in the late 70s Philips acquired a US computer chip manufacturer called Signetics. They had wanted to show off their newly acquired Signetics computer chips and as such had designed a console around them. But given that they already had their own console on the market, the Odyssey 2, Philips chose to lease out this design to other companies who would then produce consoles under a range of different brand names. The VC4000 was one of these machines. After achieving some success with this, Philips upgraded the chips and designed a new console and decided to do the same thing again, resulting in this machine, the Amazon Arcadia. The Arcadia, I'd say, is a bit of a step down from its predecessor. Not enough about the hardware had been improved given the amount of progress the competition had made during the time frame, and as a result the games were a bit dated looking for the time. Also, much like with the case with the VC4000, the games, whilst decent in number and reasonably polished, were very cookie cutter and nothing really stood out against the competition. The main advantage of the console really was its price. It was quite an inexpensive machine and was a decent budget choice. The third attempt from Commodore at making a console, and actually it's a definite improvement, still not quite up to standard though, truth be told. Again, this is another consolised version of one of their computers, but in this instance the computer design was only a year old, far less than was the case with the CD-TV and C64GS, which appeared 4 and 8 years after their computer counterparts respectively. The system had also been made to be more intuitive and easy to use for console gamers, with its software clearly marked and widespread. They also especially made some console-style joypads with triggers for the console, and a minor change or two was made to the hardware too. However, unfortunately, whilst this console did come out soon after its computer counterpart, the computer itself, the Amiga 1200, was actually a little disappointing at the time of release. Whilst the earlier Commodore machines, the Amiga 500 and C64, had really been leading the pack at release, this one was only a modest upgrade. This was the 90s and 3D gaming was the next big thing, and whilst the Amiga 1200 wasn't completely useless for these types of games, it did really struggle with both 3D graphics as well as the fake 3D method Doom and other first-person shooters of the time used. Its games in this area were crude looking or had very low frame rates, with even the Atari Jaguar noticeably dominating it in this area. The system had been made to compete with the Mega CD, but had ended up in over its head when the real competition turned up. Where it comes to other types of games though, surprisingly the software came thick and fast, with publishers rapidly converting their Amiga computer titles to CDs at a good pace, and though many of them were actually designed for the older Amiga and not the latest model, there were still a good few Amiga 1200 games available. Unexpectedly, the console actually did pretty well at first when released in Europe. It was actually Commodore's legal and financial problems at the time which stalled it, with a release in the US completely blocked by an injunction by a federal judge after Commodore had failed to pay a company what they owed. Commodore soon after went bankrupt, a big shame given what a major impact they had had on gaming through their Commodore 64 and Amiga 500 computers. I debated on whether or not to include this one for quite a while. It's almost exactly the same on the inside as the more famous Atari 5200. However, it had a more traditional controller design and didn't support the same cartridges either. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to go over some Atari history here, which always includes a bunch of confusing numbered consoles and illogical business decisions, so bear with me. So basically, after releasing the popular 2600 console, Atari had decided to release a new computer line, which ended up being somewhat successful and had some great games released for it, especially during the 1982 to 83 period when it was peaking in the US. Atari based their 5200 console on this computer hardware, but changed the cartridge slot and controller ports so that the computer games and controllers were not compatible with the console, limiting the software library and forcing users to use the specific 5200 controllers, controllers that were infamously terrible. Suffice to say, the 5200 died fast. It wasn't even released outside of America. Atari then released their new next-gen console to compete with the NES, which was the 7800. Now this all brings us back around to this console, the XEGS. In 1987, 1 year after they'd released the 7800, Atari tried yet again with the same old hardware, but this time they released a console that was completely compatible with their computers, which is really what they should have done with the Atari 5200 to begin with. So not only did they release this system 5 years too late, but Atari had also created two products that were competing with each other for the same market share. Anyway, where do I stand on all of this? Well, probably a little differently to most people, to be honest. Generally, this console's release is seen as completely unfathomable and pointless, with most having the opinion that it distracted from the 7800 and split Atari's resources. But personally, I can kind of see the logic. Atari was struggling to get any third-party support for the 7800, whilst the XEGS would have a big oven-ready library of games available straight from launch. Also, Atari had never stopped making the computer line to begin with, and said computers actually continued to be supported with new software in some parts of Europe. So, creating the XEGS gives them the ability to utilise this pre-existing European software. Given that Atari's main problem was raising cash and attracting third parties, I'd argue it was actually the 7800 that shouldn't have been released. This system was much lower risk and lower cost. And its hardware still had some trade-offs with the 7800 anyway, not to mention it still had a trick or two up its sleeve too, as homebrew titles like Crownland show. It had a lot more potential that it never achieved during its lifespan. Irrespective of what it represented at the time, nowadays it's a pretty cool retro console with a nice design and a lot of classic games inherited from the computer line. I've already covered this console's successor, the 1990 ZX Super V. This one was the original, released by Daewoo in South Korea in 1985. As mentioned before, it's a consoleized version of the original Japanese MSX computers, which were themselves based on the off-the-shelf Texas Instruments chipset. So essentially this is another ColecoVision alike, except in this case with a better sound chip. The ColecoVision had been out for 3 years by this stage, so the hardware wasn't that great for the time, especially in regards to scrolling, and reportedly the original controllers kind of sucked. But the hardware was still just about good enough to play the sorts of games that were popular at this stage, and the controllers apparently did get better over time. The original MSX was a reasonably popular computer, so there was also tons of software available for it, though unfortunately compatibility was a bit lower here than for the Super V. There were very few hardware ports on the ZX and no real expandability options, so really it just played the cartridge games. Thankfully, the majority of the best MSX games had been on cartridge anyway. Unfortunately, however, games were also rarely specifically optimised for the ZeniMax, meaning that sometimes the original MSX cartridges required now non-existent keyboard functions to work properly on the ZeniMax, rendering them unplayable. Even so, there are still a ton of MSX titles that work well on the system, including loads of classics from Konami, such as original games in the Gradius series and the very first Parodius game. Koreans did make some of their own games here and there as well, and even ported some arcade games, and given that copyright laws in Korea were in their infancy at the time, you saw some really obvious knockoffs of Mario and such hit the console too. It's interesting to look at some of the later games that were released for the MSX line, as they give you an idea of what ColecoVision games could have come to look like had they been given enough time. If the crash had never happened in the US and the ColecoVision continued to sell well, then maybe we would have seen more platformers and shooters on the system to compete with the likes of Mario and Gradius. Overall, a cool little obscurity of a console, but again, these days it's ridiculously rare, and if you're interested in the games, you're better off sticking to one of the more common Japanese MSX computers. This was SNK's attempt at entering the more mainstream console market. Previously they had released the Neo Geo AES, which was a highly impressive, highly expensive cartridge machine aimed at the premium market. The Neo Geo CD was just a later update of this system, altered to use the much cheaper CD media. Unfortunately, this change did have a detrimental effect to an extent, as all that huge game data which was previously on a cartridge that could be loaded almost instantly now had to be read off the CD by a fairly slow CD drive, and the Neo Geo CD became notorious for its long load times, with some games like Last Blade giving you 4 minutes of load times just to get into the game. Later on this problem was alleviated when the CDZ model was released, which had a double speed CD-ROM drive, but this was only released in Japan. The load times were not the only problem with the console though. Whilst the change to CDs allowed the games to become cheaper, the hardware itself was still pricey, more expensive even than the brand new PlayStation at launch. Worse still, by the time this was released the hardware had lost a lot, though to be fair not all, of its impressiveness. New arrivals like the PlayStation and Saturn could not be dominated in the same way that the Mega Drive and SNES had been by the cartridge version of the system. And whilst the Neo Geo was not lagging so much in 2D, with titles such as The Last Blade, Metal Slug and the later King of Fighters games still very much holding their own against the 2D offerings of the PS1 and Saturn, this was the era of 3D, which the Neo Geo hardware could not deal with at all. Though there is some speculation that this CD model may have been slightly better suited to 3D due to its onboard RAM, but there aren't really any releases to support this speculation currently. Just a very misjudged idea in general really, but as said, some games did still stand up for the 5th generation. With the release of the Mega Drive and the announcement of the Super Nintendo hardware, NEC, the maker of the TurboGrafx-16, started to get nervous about their own system's ability to compete. In the face of this new competition, they flinched and rushed out this new console, the Super Graphics, merely 2 years after they'd launched their last system. This turned out to be a grave mistake. People were not yet ready to upgrade, and besides, the TurboGrafx hardware was incredibly well designed and could handle itself against the competition anyway. Software support was dropped fast, with only an anemic 5 games being released in the entire library, and it was quietly swept under the carpet. You may wonder how a console with only 5 games, only half of which were good, manages to get this high up on the list. Well, it has one good point, which is the backwards compatibility with the original TurboGrafx library. Now generally I'm not putting a lot of stock into backwards compatibility in this list, but with the Super Graphics it's a bit different, as its backwards compatibility was with a system that was still up to date anyway, and would be for years to come. So whilst the console was completely redundant in its own right, and there was little to no point in buying one, if you opened up your presents on Christmas Day circa 1990 and found Granny had bought you one of these systems, you were honestly in a pretty good position. Just buy yourself Ghouls and Ghosts and 1941 Counterattack, and then spend the rest of the generation using it as a glorified TurboGrafx. You'd still have access to plenty of nice software arriving during the 90s, and would even get a perfectly good port of Street Fighter 2 in 1993 that was comparable to the Super Nintendo and Mega Drive versions. So yeah, strictly speaking it can provide a lot of entertainment, but it was a total waste of money. This was a first generation console dedicated to just playing the arcade game Stunt Cycle, which was a fairly popular game at the time, plus a few variations. You turn the console's handlebar to choose your speed and try to judge how much power was required to clear the buses. The design of the console is a nice touch, but more advanced second generation machines were already out by this stage, and the variations here don't really offer much variety. Atari created a whole slew of dedicated first generation consoles during this time. This one was designed for Sears. The main draw was its racing game, which was one of the Speed Racer style games that were popular at the time, where you just race up the screen dodging cars, though it could also play some Pong variants too. The system is well built and supports 4 players simultaneously, but things were moving pretty fast by this stage, with the Channel F kickstarting the second generation this year. This was an interesting tabletop console that incorporated an odd screen that functioned by displaying a line of pixels onto a spinning mirror to create the display, a technique that would later make an appearance in Nintendo's ill-fated Virtual Boy handheld. There wasn't many games made for it, only 4, but they are all pretty reasonable for the time, and the system was somewhat portable, more so than the Vectrex for instance, as the AdventureVision took batteries on top of having the option of plugging it into the mains, though the batteries reportedly ran down fast. The console was a failure, but an interesting one. The Telstar Arcade was a quirky first-generation console made by Coleco. It was a triangular system that could play a bunch of different cartridge games using the same method as the Soundit consoles mentioned earlier, i.e. all the hardware was put in the cartridges themselves. This was one of the earliest examples of this idea though. Another thing that was interesting about the system was its control setup. Each side of the console had a different controller. One side had a steering wheel, one side a gun, and the last had paddles for Pong and such, and the player would turn the console around depending on what type of game they were playing. The games here aren't the most polished, but all in all the console was an innovative design during a time when first generation consoles were starting to look a bit stale. I touched on this one earlier in the related Soundicvision entry. This machine made by the Hong Kong company Soundic, as well as its numerous clones released throughout Europe, achieved respectable success here, and they were actually very good value for money at the time. They offered a more limited experience of what the more powerful second generation consoles were doing, by incorporating the hardware in the cartridges instead of the consoles, and they did this at first gen prices. They were barely more expensive than the basic Pong machines, which were still selling quite well in the late 70s in the budget market, but they offered a lot more. They were of course rapidly made redundant as the second generation progressed, but they had a couple of good years in them. So the CreatorVision was a console released around the time of the similarly named but much more famous ColecoVision, and the similarities didn't end there either, as it actually had much of the same hardware in it, though did incorporate a different CPU. Surprisingly, it was possibly even an older system than the ColecoVision, perhaps being released as early as 1981. The machine was sold all around the world and did gain some minor success in some places, such as in Australia where it was released by a popular electronics company there and rebranded as the Dick Smith Wizard. The console was well built, was very capable for the time and actually quite interesting in some ways. The controllers for instance had keypads on them, and when you set 2 controllers next to each other on the console they formed a sort of mini QWERTY keyboard, which was a nice idea. Games wise everything here is a knockoff of a famous arcade game of the time. They are well made and polished but all have funny little changes made to them to avoid litigation. Its version of Donkey Kong for example has you going after a gigantic criminal who's decided to scale a nearby building for some reason, whilst its version of Pac-Man has you playing as a chicken who lays eggs and has to fill the whole screen with eggs to progress to the next level. Unfortunately the machine didn't really get any third-party support, so the library is absolutely tiny, but what is there is well done. Not the worst console out there, and certainly the best from VTech. This successor to the previously mentioned CassetteVision was released in Japan in 1984 to compete with the newly popular Famicom. As mentioned earlier, the original CassetteVision had been the major console there before being dethroned by the Famicom, and with this newer, more advanced system, console makers Epoch were intending to regain their crown from Nintendo. As you can probably guess, they didn't manage it. Unfortunately, apart from being able to push around a hefty amount of sprites, the hardware itself wasn't really that impressive, especially in the sound department. Honestly, it's one of the worst sounding consoles in this whole video. In other regards, the hardware isn't so bad for the era though. The game library was pretty small, but there were some reasonable multiplats released on there for the time, as well as a handful of notable games of its own, though nothing particularly mind-blowing. All in all, a kinda interesting console that struggled to gain a footing against its better supported rivals. Had it been more popular, its sprite pushing capabilities may have had it flourishing as a shoot 'em up console, as some homebrew releases have indicated that it is especially suited to this type of game, but as it is there's just nothing really that exceptional about the console. The Jaguar, or Jaguar as some people like to call it, was the final console from Atari. After a string of blunders over many years, the first ever major company of video gaming was unceremoniously forced to exit the console market for good. Now, against my better judgment, I kinda like this system. Don't get me wrong, it's a mediocre console, but I do feel like it has some small measure of charm. Though I guess if anything will give you more appreciation for the Jaguar, it'll be forcing yourself to learn about and play 100 different consoles for a YouTube video. Unlike most of the consoles on this list, the Jaguar actually had a handful of key games that were notable at the time. It was the first place where Rayman was announced, for example, and at release its port of Doom was the best console version of one of the seminal games of the time, not bettered until the PS1 version arrived. The hardware was reasonable for the time, and the price was very competitive. Believe it or not, Atari was quite fortunate that this machine fell into their lap. Designed by the British company Flair, who were ex-Sinclair staff who'd previously designed the Connex Multisystem, a console that had been heavily covered in UK magazines, but ultimately never released. Flair had the experience and know-how to design a respectable 3D polygon pushing system. Unfortunately though, by the 90s Atari was honestly not in any position to be releasing anything. Many people talk of how the system was killed by a lack of software support, and whilst it's true there's little here of worth, the truth of the matter is that they couldn't really even manufacture or distribute these machines at the sort of levels required for success anyway. Atari actually fell down at the first hurdle and only managed to manufacture an anemic number of them. There were other notable issues as well though, of course. The hardware was rushed to market and as such was buggy, and whilst it had reasonable polygon pushing abilities, it wasn't so well suited to texturing said polygons, which was to become more and more important as time went on. Atari had also done a bad job with the controllers, as per usual for the company really, to be honest. They were unwieldy and even included their own number pad, a feature that everyone else had realised was a crap idea a decade earlier. Worse still, the original version of the pad didn't even include side buttons, making strafing in first-person shooters unnecessarily finicky. Not a great end for Atari, but it could have been worse to be honest. This is the predecessor of the earlier mentioned Emerson Arcadia, and like that system, was developed by Philips and then leased out to other companies to produce under different names. This VC4000 model was the first one to hit the market. The most interesting thing about this particular model of the hardware was it actually incorporated a self-writing analog stick in its packing controller, the first of its kind, predating and surpassing the 5200's controller that would arrive years later. And it's actually a quite reliable controller too, unlike that console's notorious one. Games wise it's not so interesting though, just about everything on it is a knockoff of early popular Atari 2600 games. The system was supported for a few years, it was quite robustly built and it was a reasonable price too, so it wasn't that bad all in all. This was a late first gen console based on a popular arcade game, Tank. This home version gives you a really nice setup with 2 joysticks for each player to control the tanks, with 5 buttons on top of said sticks to shoot. This configuration allows you to use proper tank controls, including rotating and reversing, which were not featured in the more famous console versions of the game, such as Combat on the 2600. It was a nice machine, but these first-gen consoles were quick becoming redundant. At least this one had gameplay advantages though, and a memorable gimmick that gave it an edge. This arrived shortly before the release of the Atari 2600 in 1977, so things were moving at quite a fast pace by this stage. The console plays variations of Breakout and Pinball games, with the paddle on the top controlling the Breakout variations and the 2 buttons on either side of the console controlling the flippers in the Pinball games. A really nice touch. It's a very polished product coming at a time when home versions of popular arcade games like Breakout were still not yet common. What's more, the game apparently actually saved the player's score, which is also quite rare for the time. It was a little late for sure, but still kinda cool, and even 5 years later, magazines like Electronic Games were still saying it had 2 of the best pinball programs available. A reasonably impressive first generation console that even used interchangeable cartridges, which was uncommon at the time. These cartridges were not however the ones we all know and love, as they didn't contain any information on the cartridge. They just changed the behaviour of the console in minor ways. Aside from one chasing game, the cartridges are all just Pong variants. Shortly afterwards, Pong consoles would actually include all of these variations inbuilt as standard, but this was not common at the time of the Video 2000's release, so it was a somewhat respectable machine, for a while at least. So this one is very interesting. It's a motion-controlled console focused on sports games that was made and released by ex-Nintendo employees. These were staff members who had previously worked on the NES back in the 1980s. Each game for the system included its own specific peripherals, such as baseball bats, bowling balls, tennis rackets and boxing gloves and such. There was even a fitness game featuring Jackie Chan that came with a pressure-sensitive mat. The motion control in the games is actually not that bad, surprisingly. I feel like Nintendo really must have been influenced by the console, as it really is almost like Wii Sports and Wii Fit before they existed. Hardware-wise, this works like those late first-gen systems we mentioned earlier, with much of the hardware being in the cartridges themselves and not in the console. So whilst the release games didn't look particularly impressive graphically, had the console taken off, the hardware in the games themselves could have been upgraded over time to provide improvements. All in all, the Zavex was a notable console at an affordable price that never really took off or gained the credit it deserved, In many ways it was the first sign of the movement towards motion controls of that generation, preempting the Wii, which would build on the idea and dominate the market just 2 years later. Going into this list, I had no idea just how much of a part the Dutch tech giant Philips had played in video gaming. Sure, I knew of the failed CDI, and I vaguely knew they were involved with the Odyssey 2 as well, but this company were actually involved with the creation of loads of consoles right from the beginning of the media. This particular console, the Telespiel 2201, especially actually quite impressed me, and I'd never heard of it prior to making this video. It was a cartridge-based console from 1975, so it's one of the oldest consoles on the list and one of the earliest cartridge-based machines. The cartridges are akin to those of the original Odyssey and Video 2000, so there's no data in them, they just change the way the console behaves. But they managed to get far more variety into the games than the competition who were also using this method. You'll notice a crude shooting game and even a simple speed race style game. Definitely one of the more versatile of first generation consoles at release. This was yet another ColecoVision-alike console. This one from the toy manufacturer Tomy was released in 1983 and was a console version of their earlier computer, the Tomy Pewter, which had actually gotten a release in Britain as the Grandstand Tutor. Much like most of the other consoles based on the same hardware, it was decently powered but now becoming somewhat unremarkable tech, and given the release date would quickly be totally outshone by the NES in Japan, which was released just a couple of months later. Given that the console supported all of the computer line software, it did however have a good start straight out of the gate and grew a decent and fairly consistent library of titles. Though not very large in size, the library includes a few moderately interesting titles in it to bolster some of the bread and butter arcade ports, and as ever the Texas Instruments chips do a perfectly fine job with the graphics. This was an alright system. It could have been good, but it just didn't do enough to separate itself from the pack. This was the original party machine with 4 controller ports, and unlike the more famous early 4-port console, the Atari 5200, this actually utilised them with a nice selection of 4-player games, which unfortunately I can't really show off here as I didn't have 3 people with me when making the montage. The Astrocade was a system from Bally that went up against the 2600 but was sold more in a premium market, being one of the most expensive consoles of all time. It was in the same price ballpark as the 3DO and Neo Geo would be many years later. Though to be honest, the comparison's not quite fair to the Astrocade, as it was a different time and console prices in general were higher in the late 70s. But still, it was expensive by 70s standards and super expensive by console standards in general. As you'd expect from the price of it, the hardware was quite impressive for the time and could do a much better job at recreating big popular arcade games than the 2600 could. However, it did reportedly fail at quite a high rate, with reliability issues plaguing the system to this day, and the lack of sales at the time also meant that the software library is quite small, albeit what there is of a consistently high quality. The controllers for the system were quite interesting. They were handheld joysticks that I can only think to compare to the Wii's nunchuck attachment, a single piece controller with a trigger button and a joystick on the top. The joystick itself could also be rotated like a dial to play breakout style games and such. The influence here was definitely the earlier Fairchild Channel F controller, which had a very similar shape and functionality to it, but Bally's implementation was much better. All in all, a reasonable console. It was impressive for the time and it did offer things that its competition did not, such as the 4-player functionality and more complex controller. It's just a shame it was so pricey and unreliable. When I originally started forming this list, which must have been 2 odd years ago now, the 5200 was actually a good bit higher placed than this. The system represented a major hardware leap above its predecessor, the Atari 2600, with tiled multicolour graphics, hardware scrolling and a real sound chip. It could do the big arcade games of the time very well in a way that the 2600 just could not, and it even had some newer games of its own, more advanced and in-depth than those of the 2600. This, however, was my experience through emulation, very different to using the real thing, as the main Achilles heel of this system was always the controllers. I'd known for many years that the ineffectual joysticks of the 5200, which lacked self-centering, made for some inaccurate control, and that they were also notorious for being unreliable, but I hadn't realised just how bad they were. The experience of playing and owning one of these systems in the mid-80s was probably of, well, not playing it, as the controllers were seemingly always in a state of disrepair. There were third-party offerings available at the time which alleviated this issue, an adapter from Masterplay that let you use Atari 2600 controllers on it for example, as well as a third-party controller from Wico with self-centering. But talking to the people who owned them at the time, none of these options seem ideal, as all have their own issues, and the majority of fans seem to think it was best to buy both of these options and learn to do a quick fix on the official controllers, and this fix would have to be repeated every month or so. It's a great shame that for me, the Atari console with the second most competitive library of games for its time after the 2600 is crippled by its controllers, but that's just the way it is. It was very nice hardware and the library was great too, and perhaps a dedicated and informed owner of the time could have gotten all of these peripherals and learned to do the fixes. But nobody should be expected to do all that. Apart from the cost involved, I mean honestly, what a ball ache. The good news though is that this console was actually very much just a consolised version of Atari's 8-bit computer line. Pretty much every game released on it was on those computers, and said computers just used the generic Atari 2600 controllers too. Often the games themselves were even on cartridges, so really it's best to just forget this console ever existed and pick up one of those old computers if you want to experience this phase of Atari's history. Heck, if you absolutely had to get a console, you could even get one of the aforementioned XEGS consoles. I do wonder how much this console might have contributed to the subsequent video game crash of 1983. People often focus on the Atari 2600 and its glut of expensive shovelware as the main cause. But really, if you've decided to upgrade your console in 1982, then spent a lot of money on the 5200, only to have your controllers fail within a month, forcing you to buy more controllers which subsequently fail again and again until you ultimately give up and it becomes a doorstop, I don't think it's entirely unbelievable that you'd start to rethink your passion for gaming entirely. The SG-1000, Sega's often forgotten first foray into home consoles. Yeah, that's right, the Master System was actually their second console. Though as mentioned earlier, Japan's home console market was somewhat lagging behind the rest of the world during the early 80s, with many of the consoles available being 4 or 5 years out of date in comparison to what was going on in the United States. Sega sought to end this situation by producing the SG-1000, a system that had hardware that was pretty much identical to that of the ColecoVision. Yep, it's another one. This would bring Japan more up to date with the US and closer to recent events. Unfortunately for Sega though, Nintendo had decided to bring out their own console and had excelled themselves, designing it as a state-of-the-art games machine that could do their arcade hits justice, and they were set to release it on the same day as the SG-1000. Now, taking one look at the games of the system and comparing them to those of the NES library probably isn't very flattering to the machine, but this is somewhat misleading, as the SG-1000 was only really competing with the NES for a couple of years before Sega released their true competitor, the Master System. So the only types of NES games which were around at the time were things like Donkey Kong and Popeye and the like, with second-year titles like Xevious and Excitebike being pretty much the most impressive NES games available during this time frame. One lucky break for Sega was that Nintendo had chosen to block third-party developers during these early days, only slowly opening up the console to third-party support over the coming 2 to 3 years. As a result, the SG-1000 had quite a comparable sized library while the two were competing, and was only really obliterated from around 1985 onwards. The SG-1000 was a likeable console that got decent support during its short lifespan, with games even being released up until 1987. In general, most of the popular genres of the time were represented in its library, and it had some ports of Sega arcade games not released elsewhere on it, such as Starjacker, as well as a game called Girl's Garden, which was the first title made by the creator of Sonic, Yuji Naka. Like most of the ColecoVision alikes, unfortunately this does not support ColecoVision games. There was however another identical system in Japan called the Othello Multivision, and it would play the games of that system, which included a decent port of Qbert. Ah, Pong, the first ever video game to achieve mass market success. Prior to Pong, video games were usually only played by computer nerds using incredibly expensive and unwieldy machines in universities, but with the release of Pong, video games really entered the public consciousness, first in the arcades and then later on with this Atari home release version of the game. This was very, very polished by the standards of the time. It played great and the presentation values, like that iconic and memorable multicolour display effect, were excellent too. So why, you may ask, is such an important machine not higher on the list? Well, in reality this wasn't actually the first home console. It wasn't really even the first Pong in a home in many ways, as the game of Pong had actually been kind of an update made by Atari of a previous ping pong game for another home console, made by a company called Magnavox that had never really achieved much popularity. Atari had taken that electronic ping pong game and then added scoring and other gameplay tweaks to make it play better, and then released it as Pong in the arcades to lots of success. That original ping pong console is still yet to come. Here we have the first ever console to have interchangeable ROM cartridges, beating the Atari 2600 to market by nearly a year. Now, as mentioned earlier, some of the first gen consoles did sort of have interchangeable games, but none of them actually held information on the game itself that was read by a console's CPU, not until the Channel F. This cartridge system had taken Fairchild quite a while to work out all the kinks. It was inspired by the already common practice of manufacturers slotting memory chips into motherboards, but the developers of the machine knew that consumers couldn't be expected to take apart their machine and slot these little chips in and out every time they wanted to change games. Apart from how tedious that would be, the chips were not built to be constantly plugged and unplugged into their sockets and would be damaged over time. So the Fairchild's creators came up with a much more reliable and durable way of implementing the system, as well as one that was intuitive enough for consumers to get to grips with easily. One of their staff who had been working in this area was also then subsequently poached by Atari to help with their own cartridge system. Outside of the interchangeable games, the controllers are also really interesting and innovative. They have a lot of functions. As I touched upon in the Bally Astrocade entry, these were kind of like the Wii's nunchuck attachment, but with a joystick that could also be rotated left and right and pushed in and pulled out for 2 different fire buttons. So this had an awful lot of functions in comparison to most of its competitors for the time, and it was put to good use in many of the system's games as well. Its version of Pong, for example, allows you to angle the bats, and in its version of Tank Combat you can not only move around the screen but can also angle your turret in different directions. The library is admittedly quite small, with only a few key titles, but I find the console and its controllers to have some charm, and kickstarting the second generation and its explosion in game variety is also kind of a big deal and definitely cements its placing in the top 25. The 3DO is an often maligned console that was made by EA founder Trip Hawkins, who, with the 3DO hardware, had aimed to create an industry standard console design that could be leased out and manufactured by a variety of different electronics companies. Basically, he wanted the video game market to be more like the film and music markets, so that consumers wouldn't need to buy different consoles to play different games, as all available consoles would follow the same standard. Unfortunately for Trip, his dream was not to be, and the only thing his console ended up being famous for was its very high price of around $700, which is closer to $1,200 in today's money when taking into account inflation. Sadly, this was due to the market model Trip had laid out. Usually consoles are sold as a loss leader and money is made back on the games. But given that 3DOs were being manufactured by companies that had no history of making games and whom were not collecting royalties either, they could not sell them at a loss. The price did drop after a while, and actually by the time the PS1 and Saturn were out, the 3DO was effectively a cool little budget console, but by this stage all momentum for it had gone and it was destined for the great console game room in the sky. The 3DO was actually quite an impressive system for its era, and unlike many of its contemporaries, actually did a pretty good job of predicting the way that the market would go, with its hardware ethos really not being a million miles away from the direction that Sony would go with when releasing the PlayStation a year later. Though of course not as powerful a machine, it still handled textured polygons decently, and at least correctly chose the CD format over cartridges too. The software library is actually quite large and varied, but there's a lot of shovelware on it. Still, there were a bunch of good games from EA, Crystal Dynamics and even the 3DO company themselves which graced the system, many of which would end up being ported to the big guys later on, with the 3DO almost being used as a sort of early training ground for when the major consoles would later turn up. There are also a number of interesting PC ports on the system, many of which were never released on any other console. So what do I think of it overall? Well, I think it's quite an underrated system, to be honest. Not that I think it's really great or anything. This is a console I would only just consider breaking into the OK tier, but certainly it's not deserving of all of the hate it's gotten over the years. In fact, the industry feeling at the time was actually quite lukewarm, with the feeling being that it was an OK console that was too expensive and took too long to get going. I think during the early days of YouTube, channels like Game Trailers really did a number on the 3DO with their worst consoles lists and such, and it was then that the public perception really soured on the system. Thankfully I feel that this is coming to an end now and the 3DO is starting to be viewed in a slightly more positive light again. Now this is definitely one of the more unique consoles on the list. Most of the home consoles of the Vectrix's time were focused on 2D sprite based graphics, but the Vectrix did something completely different. It went with an early form of 3D graphics that plotted out lines on the display to create simple geometric shapes, a much smoother method for displaying 3D than what other consoles of the time had available. These types of vector-based games had often been popular in the arcades with games like Battlezone, so it made sense that some industrious person would attempt a home console primarily created to play these types of games, and with the Vectrix they did an admirable job. This display method requires a specific type of monitor, so the system had to be a tabletop console and include its own screen. It wasn't really that portable though, as it didn't take batteries and as such had to be plugged into the mains, but you could somewhat transport it around and play it at the houses of friends and family and such. The display was black and white, but each game came with its own colour overlay that you placed on the screen to give it the appearance of colour, which works decently for what it is. On top of the interesting 3D focus, the Vectrix also had a very notable controller, a pad that included a self-writing analog thumbstick, very similar to the one that would adorn the N64 controller a decade later, and which would become an integral part of the way 3D games would come to be played. Here, however, sadly the analog stick is very much underutilised, with no games really taking advantage of it. In fact, in my experience, many owners of the system didn't even know the joystick was analog, so little was it used in the games. And where it comes to the games themselves, the library is not really all that big, with only some 28 odd games made for it. Unfortunately, the Vectrix never really took off in a big way, and soon after it was launched the US was going through the video game crash and businesses were going bankrupt left, right and centre. Thankfully, what is here is very consistent and diverse for the time, with very few duds though, so there was a decent amount of fun to be had with the system. Shortly after creating home video game consoles with the Odyssey 1, Magnavox was bought out by electronics giant Philips. Under Philips, a successor console was released, the Odyssey 2, or Philips VideoPack G7000 as it was called in Europe. This is an underrated little machine, I think. Out of these pre-Intellivision consoles, this was definitely the one that gave the Atari 2600 the biggest run for its money. It was cheaper than the 2600, and its hardware had a very different design ethos with different strengths and weaknesses. Though not as versatile as the 2600, it was quite adept at putting a lot of moving objects on the screen without flicker, which was something that the 2600 often stumbled on. One thing I like about this console is that its software library really had its own flavour. The US boxes for the games are very memorable and quite iconic with their neon colours and Tron-like designs, but the games library itself was also full of personality, which few consoles outside of the 2600 could say during these early days. Like many other consoles of the time, the Odyssey would be full of ports of the most popular arcade games, but every time this was done on Odyssey, the programmers gave the game their own spin, which often drastically changed the way the game was played. Its version of Breakout, for example, had a two-player competitive aspect, where one player destroyed the bricks whilst another tried to rebuild them, whilst its Space Invaders gave the aliens their own shields and had you re-armouring from the bases when taking a hit. The main game for the Odyssey though was its take on Pac-Man, a game called Casey Munchkin. Pac-Man was one of the hottest games at the time, and Atari had totally fumbled the ball with their version, delivering a poorly balanced game that was ugly and full of flicker. Magnavox, on the other hand, had hit the ball out of the park with their highly polished and playable maze game. Casey Munchkin was somewhat different to its main inspiration. The dots were no longer as numerous as before, and they actually moved around the screen, but it still retained much of Pac-Man's playability. Even more notably for such an old game though, was that it came with its own maze editor, so the player could actually design their own courses to play in. This game alone grew the system's popularity immensely and got it noticed by the public, leading to it getting shut down by Atari with them claiming it infringed on their copyright. Unfairly, I would say, as I feel they changed the game more than enough. A very likeable console all in all. I'm sure this placing will be unpopular, but I'm sorry. To me this console was basically just a 360 released a year later for $200 more and with an early lifespan software drought. Sure, it was more reliable than the 360. That's not really saying much given how shamefully unreliable that console was. And taken on its own merit, the PS3 itself was actually way below industry standards in regards to reliability too. In a very real sense, this was Sony's Sega Saturn, an ill-conceived machine that was handily undercut and outplayed by the competition. Sony rested on its laurels while their competition innovated. Don't get me wrong, the system did end up becoming a pretty cool console with its own flavour and memorable library, but this was a very long and arduous process. The PS3 didn't equalise the 360 in numbers of good exclusives until 2013. This was the year the PS4 arrived, and by which point Microsoft had switched focus to their upcoming Xbox One console. And this milestone was only really possible due to the PS3 being able to ride the coattails of its popular forebears. To an extent it could rely solely on brand name and Sony's huge coffers alone, something that Sega did not have access to. And in the end the losses Sony incurred with this console ended up dwarfing those of the Saturn and Dreamcast. The PS3's first year saw Sony scrambling to copy features from the 360, and a year and a half into the PS3 lifespan it managed to get its dashboard, the cross-media bar, working in-game through a software update. Previously PS3 users had to leave the game to access it. Sony's answer to the 360's achievement system, which they named trophies, also arrived at this time. The PS3 was not really designed with a lot of these features in mind though, so some 360 features, such as cross-game chat, never did see the light of day. Sony also quickly managed to get rumble features back into their controllers. This feature had been omitted from the PS3 controllers at launch due to Sony being caught up in legal battles with the creators, but they settled and the issue was put to rest in 2007. Even where some of the PS3's advantages were concerned, such as with the admirable decision to make its online gaming features completely free, unlike Microsoft's subscription service, were tarred by subsequent events. with the PS3 being subject to one of the largest data breaches in history, where hackers accessed the personal accounts of millions of its users. Due to this, the PS3's online service was down for long stretches of time, as Sony desperately tried to plug holes in their security. Even the system's much touted power was often not on display, with many multi-platform games actually running slightly better on the 360 due to being designed with that system in mind. As mentioned earlier though, the system did grow its library, and by the end of the generation it had become a console worth owning. And due to supporting the Blu-ray format, the console also eliminated the need for having games on multiple discs and provided PS3 owners access to high-definition movies straight out of the box, 2 years before 360 owners would gain access to Netflix. Thankfully, Sony would also manage to completely steer back on course with the excellent PS4 during the next generation, while it was Microsoft that would be taken down by hubris next time around. And again, I know that this is another quite popular console, but I've just never been that enamoured with it. And when you're this far into a top 100, any choice you make is going to be hated by one group or another anyway, because at this stage all of the consoles are pretty cool, to be honest. But something has to be put at the back end. So basically, to my mind, I put the GameCube into a similar bracket as the PS3, in that whilst it had a handful of key titles, games like Metroid Prime, Smash Melee and F-Zero GX, to the PS3's Uncharted, The Last of Us, Metal Gear Solid 4, apart from these games, you weren't really missing out on a whole lot if you just stuck to one of the main competitors during the generation. The console was really just a bit redundant all in all. Shigeru Miyamoto once lamented that he felt that during the GameCube era, Nintendo just started following other people's trends instead of doing their own thing, and I would have to agree with him. The GameCube was actually the console that I chose during the era, and this was exactly how I'd always felt about the machine. When you're following trends, you're self-evidently always going to be behind what the competition is doing. Nintendo were also coming into a very difficult period at the time, and were very much on the ropes. With the N64 they'd been overtaken by Sony in popularity and lost a lot of ground on third-party support. Nintendo came out of this situation primarily blaming it on the fact that they had stuck with the cartridge format in the previous generation, and they thought developers would come running back to them now that the GameCube would be using its own disc media, even though Nintendo's licensing fees were still way higher than what was being asked by Sony and Microsoft. Of course this didn't happen, and it wasn't until Nintendo dropped their own licensing fees that games started to be ported to the machine in any numbers. The GameCube also had a very difficult start in general. Rare had stuck with N64 development for too long, didn't have any GameCube games ready at launch, and were soon bought out by Microsoft, and as already mentioned, the third-party software just didn't turn up. Nintendo started to panic and began rushing their games to fill the void, which is something that they basically never do. This led to some titles like Luigi's Mansion and Pikmin being very, very short, and others like Mario Sunshine and Wind Waker being padded out with blue coin challenges and Triforce quests and the like, due to them having to cut out some of the levels to get the games out early and plug that leaky hole. Lastly, in regards to the software, I have to say, Nintendo were incredibly fortunate that Sega were knocked out during this generation, as Sega were one of the only major third parties putting any priority into the system early on. Without the Dreamcast ports like the Sonic Adventures, Crazy Taxi and Skies of Arcadia, as well as the quirky originals like Monkey Ball and Billy Hatcher, and even F-Zero GX, which was actually outsourced to Sega's team at Amusement Vision, the GameCube would have been very much a lesser console than it was, especially during those difficult early years. At least, and it's actually a pretty big at least, the console's hardware was very cheap and powerful for the time and represented great value for money. In fact, I really have no complaints with the hardware at all. It's fantastic. Well, I guess it looks a little silly, but that's really a superficial complaint. I love the GameCube's controllers, which have to be some of the most comfortable controllers I've ever held, and the system always provided very vibrant and smooth graphics, with an excellent picture quality. Most of the multi-platform games that turned up also had very nice versions on the GameCube, so whilst GameCube owners spent a lot of time waiting for PS2 ports, when they did arrive, they were generally a little nicer. Often referred to as the Rolls-Royce of gaming for its time, at launch the Neo Geo sold for some $650, which is the equivalent of well over $1,000 in today's money when taking into account inflation. And with highly impressive games that each also cost hundreds of dollars, it's easy to see how it got this reputation. Why was it so expensive? Well, this was basically state-of-the-art arcade hardware brought to the home, with huge cartridges that contained a metric ton of data for the time, enough data that they could hold all the animation frames of the latest fighting games, for instance. If you wanted the best of the best in the early 90s and had money to burn, this was the console for you. In fact, initially in 1990 the machine was only even really designed to be rented out in places like hotels and such, but after a lot of positive consumer response, SNK expanded sales to the general public too. A somewhat surprising aspect relating to the system is that it was likely the first ever to use memory cards to save your game progress, which obviously ended up being very much a part of many later consoles. You could even take your Neo Geo memory card to the arcades with you and continue your game there on one of the compatible machines if you so wanted. The game library is only a little over 100 games, but as you'd expect from this type of system, the quality is fairly consistent. This isn't the sort of machine that attracts the publishers of shovelware, it's just too niche. The library size can also be increased further with the purchase of converters, which gave you the ability to play the actual original arcade versions of Neo Geo games as well, as opposed to just the home releases made specifically for the home console. Not only were there more titles released for the arcade hardware, but these versions are also much cheaper these days due to being less in demand. Now, in regards to the games themselves, the Neo Geo sometimes unfairly gets criticised for only having 2D fighting games on it and little else. This is very much untrue. There especially were many high quality shoot-em-ups and sports games on the machine, and it had pretty decent numbers of brawlers and puzzle games on it as well. There were some genres that admittedly were largely absent though. Given that this was really just a home arcade machine, it's mainly the sorts of genres not seen in the arcades that suffered. Primarily things like RPGs and adventure games and such, that do not have the immediacy required to grab the player right there and then and convince them to part with their cash for 10 or 20 minute sessions at a time. The system's software lifespan also ended up being incredibly impressive, with it being supported for well over a decade, making it one of the longest commercially supported consoles in gaming history. All in all, it was a very impressive system, but obviously given its price a very niche one as well, that few would have been able to experience at the time. The first console that looked like it might have a chance of dethroning the almighty Atari 2600. The Intellivision was an advanced forward-thinking machine from Mattel that would correctly predict the market direction and give an indication of what was to come. It was a drastic improvement over earlier systems like the 2600 and Odyssey 2. Apart from including sprites, which many previous consoles had had, though not to this level, the Intellivision actually had a background constructed out of tiles and a hardware ability to scroll these tiles vertically and horizontally. This efficient method allowed for more colourful backgrounds at less cost to memory and would be the setup for the majority of subsequent 2D game consoles like the NES. Other than the graphics, the system had an advanced sound chip for the time. In fact, the sound chip is even a little bit better than the one that was used in the stock Master System released 5 or 6 years later. The controller used a directional disc that you pushed down on with your thumb to control its games that almost functioned like a sort of proto D-pad, though nowhere near as accurate. The system even had an early download service where games could be downloaded through cable TV. The games library is of a decent size, not that large but fairly diverse and much more consistent in quality than that of the Atari 2600, and here we were starting to see the growth of newer, more interesting types of games like RPGs and strategy titles, as well as better representations of established genres like sports, with the system's high sprite count making it especially well suited to these types of games, and unsurprisingly it was with the sports genre that it would drum up the most public interest. All of this came at a cost though, as the Intellivision was quite an expensive machine at launch, pricier even than the PS3 when taking into account inflation, though it must be reiterated, consoles during the Intellivision's era were more expensive in general, though not usually quite to this level. With all of this in mind, I'm sad to say that the system was never really able to reach its full potential though, with many of the major developers choosing to stick to the 2600 or producing quick ports to the Intellivision that didn't really utilise its feature set. More recently though, we've been able to really see what the console was capable of, as it now has a very healthy homebrew scene with a lot of tools that make it much easier to produce high quality games for it that really show off the untapped potential of the machine, resulting in a plethora of new releases that give a better understanding and appreciation of the strengths of the hardware's design. So we've covered a bunch of consoles already that were caught unawares by the 3D revolution, but possibly the biggest casualty of this changeover was Sega, who had been one of the biggest gaming companies prior to the release of the ill-fated Saturn, rivaling Nintendo in prominence. Magazines of the day laid out the course of events, but this speculation was eventually corroborated in recent interviews with Sega's employees too. Basically, the Saturn was initially designed for 2D games in mind, and unfortunately, while Sega were at the forefront of 3D games at the time, most of the expertise was in Yu Suzuki's arcade team, who were busy making arcade games at this point, with the other Sega teams being largely inexperienced with 3D. Midway through development of the hardware, Sega realised they had gravely misjudged the direction of the market, and during 1993 they panicked and started to bolt extra pieces of hardware onto the Saturn at the last minute in a bid to get it up to par in 3D capability with the soon-to-be-released PlayStation. Unfortunately, this caused it to become an inefficient, unwieldy and expensive design. Sega sold the Saturn at a large loss, but was still way above the PlayStation's price even at that stage. They ended up cutting the prices even further in order to compete, which Sony responded to by cutting their own prices, Before long a price war ensued and Sega were now hemorrhaging money. The rest is history. Software-wise, the Saturn had actually quite a large library of games. This was mainly due to it being a moderate success in Japan, as Virtua Fighter was a huge phenomenon there when the Saturn was launched. And actually it wasn't until the announcement that Square's RPGs were going to be appearing on Sony's console did the PlayStation start to conclusively lead in that territory. The software situation started out a bit rocky, but very quickly developers started to master the hardware more and more, and we saw some key titles appear. Highly impressive 3D games like Sega Rally, Virtua Fighter 2 and the Panzer Dragoon games, many of which blew away the PS1's offerings at the time of their release. There were also a bunch of nice JRPGs on the system like Grandia, the Shining games, and the now notoriously expensive Panzer Dragoon Saga. And the US company Lobotomy also created a very underrated first-person shooter for the system called Power Slave, and then subsequently used its engine to create some very nice ports of Duke Nukem and Quake. In the end it was really just not to be though. A system with such rocky foundations was always going to struggle, talking consumers into paying out more for your console when its performance was generally, though not always, worse in most instances, was always going to be a very, very hard sell. And areas where the Saturn did have a strength, such as with 2D gaming, had fallen out of favour with the public and were seen as passé at the time. Still, its 2D expertise and large library of fantastic 2D scrolling shoot-'em-up and fighters make it a darling among retro gamers to this day, and many of its titles are fondly remembered and highly sought after. Unfortunately, the Saturn was just not part of the zeitgeist of the times, which is a real shame, especially given that Sega had done so much for 3D gaming in the arcades. Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing and Daytona had done much to popularise 3D gaming, but in the console world it was the Tekkens and Ridge Racers that inherited the earth. This is where it all started, the first video game console ever made and the progenitor of every other console on this list. The Odyssey was an American console made in the early 1970s by an electronics manufacturer called Magnavox. The system's primary reason for purchase was its crude proto-version of Pong, which ended up influencing the creation of the much more familiar Atari arcade Pong. The system isn't just here for being first though. While simple in comparison to later releases of its generation, for its time it was actually quite forward-thinking and tried to provide a decent amount of variety. For instance, there were actually different games available that you could swap around in the machine. Now, while superficially looking like the cartridges we all know and love, they actually aren't, as there's no information held on them. They essentially work by just bridging the gaps in the console circuitry in slightly different ways to create slightly different effects. Regardless, I'd imagine this system of swapping games in and out probably did help to inspire the later cartridge designs as well. Anyway, about the games. The Odyssey came with a whole bunch of highly simplistic games which used screen overlays for your TV, as well as other paraphernalia that you were supposed to use to alter the gameplay. Now, much of the variation was based on following rules that required a hefty amount of user input and self-restraint as well, as no scoring or automatic upholding of rules really applied, but at least the option was there. More interesting though is the light gun peripheral, which allowed the playing of very simplistic light gun games, where one player would have to move a light around the screen whilst the other would have to shoot at it. Very simple, but again a nice feature to have and another example that showed that whilst the machine was crude by the standards of the later first generation machines, there was a whole lot of imagination put into its workings. So next we have the Sega Master System. Now I'll admit placing this one was difficult. I feel that generally putting it above the Saturn is probably an unpopular opinion among Sega fans, and for a long time I honestly had them the other way around, but in the end I think for the time in which it was released this was probably the better buy. I think this not because I believe it to have the bigger or better library of the two, because frankly it doesn't, although make no mistake the Master System was no lightweight in this regard either. It had a great library with many key titles for the time, games like Alex Kidd in Miracle World, Dragon's Trap, R-Type and the superlative Fantasy Star were some of the best games of their era. No, Master System is above the Saturn mainly due to its fantastic price-performance ratio. This console had really nice hardware for its time and spent almost the entire generation in the same price bracket as the NES, even though the graphics these systems produced were in no way comparable at all. The Master System was good value for money and fitted in with the ethos of its time in a way that the Saturn often struggled with. In general, the Master System I think is one of the more underrated retro consoles. It seems to me that it's usually seen as providing pretty much non-existent competition for the NES, but this view is really not remotely fair at all, as I feel it offered a unique and worthwhile experience in its own right, quite different to that of the NES. Of course, having the pause button on the console itself instead of the controller, like the NES did, often causing the player to have to lean over to the console in order to pause the game or enter an equipment menu or such, was admittedly an oversight. and there were nowhere near as many games on it as the NES, whose library completely dwarfed it in size, but there was still always a steady and diverse flow of software coming, certainly more than enough to keep anyone entertained, and the games that you did get would provide visuals that for the time had surprisingly few noticeable compromises. Heck, this was the first console that I can remember that even allowed you to hook it up to the TV with high quality RGB cables, which increased the fidelity even further. Strangely enough, the Master System received two different sound setups depending on the model, with one of the Japanese models containing the usual sound chip that we in the West are all familiar with, but also a more advanced FM sound chip. Very often the games supported both setups depending on what model they were being played on, and would automatically utilise the FM sound chip if detected. Sadly, we never got this enhanced model in the West, nor did we get the upgrade add-on that the Japanese also received for their models without the FM chip, but at least we get to use it in emulation. Another interesting point worth mentioning is that the games on the Master System actually came in two different formats. You had the familiar cartridges, which most major games arrived on, but you also had these simpler games which came on these little cards that had been passed on from Sega's earlier console, the SG-1000. These Master System games were effectively sold as budget games for people who were more strapped for cash, which was another admirable inclusion. Sadly, the machine passed most gamers by. In Japan it was released too late to compete with the NES, and in America it was most certainly bogged down by advertising and distribution issues. Only really in Western Europe, Australia and Brazil was it a success, and as such we got many more games released here than other territories. People often lament about how many quality Saturn games never left Japan, but this is almost just as true for the Master System outside of Europe in many ways. This is actually a really great machine that people rarely talk about, and it has to be placed as yet another of the most underrated consoles of all time. The ColecoVision was released in 1982 to much fanfare. The hardware was very affordable, and this was actually probably the first instance of a console being released at what we would consider to be a modern price range. Everything prior to this had been very expensive by modern standards, whilst most consoles afterwards would end up being placed in a similar price bracket to this. Coleco, who were already somewhat established in gaming through their Telstar series of Pong machines, had managed to come out with a truly excellent product at a great price. The system was famously bundled with Donkey Kong as a pack-in, which was the console's killer app at the time. Donkey Kong had been a phenomenon in the arcades, but until this point no home console had really been able to do the game justice. Remember that the NES didn't yet exist at this stage. Then the ColecoVision version turned up, and no longer did gamers have to settle for a blocky, vague blob representing Mario as he walked through barely recognisable levels. No, the ColecoVision could do high-resolution graphics for the time, and by doubling up on sprites we even got a multicolour Mario. But Donkey Kong wasn't the only game the ColecoVision had. Oh no, the software library of the machine actually grew at a very fast rate, ending up quite respectable in size for a console that had such a short lifespan. And it was very consistent too. Very unlike the Atari 2600, the ColecoVision ended up with quite reasonable quality control with far fewer stinkers. It was also quite a vibrant library for its time as well, with lots of variety, with many of the newer types of games and genres that had started making inroads on the Intellivision making an appearance here as well, but with a much smoother and higher fidelity experience. Titles like Fortune Builder and Alcazar would be an early peek into what the future had coming for the gaming world, and many of the most interesting games coming out for computers of the time, like Boulder Dash and Montezuma's Revenge, would also see ports on the ColecoVision. Another interesting feature of the console was its expansion module 1. This add-on to the console actually made the system compatible with its rival, the Atari 2600's games. Coleco had reverse engineered Atari's console and created the add-on out of off-the-shelf parts, an act that seems so audacious these days that it has to be commended for its out-and-out brazenness. Atari took Coleco to court over the add-on, and a settlement was reached where Coleco would pay Atari royalties on the sales of their add-on. As you can guess, the ColecoVision had many advantages, and its sales in the US actually picked up very quickly, with the console hitting 1 million sales by the start of 1983. The future looked very rosy for the ColecoVision. So what happened? Well, unfortunately the US was about to enter a massive gaming slump as the entire industry crashed, stalling sales of the ColecoVision and bringing the whole US industry to its knees, to the extent that it would take years for it to recover, and Japan would take over from the US as the dominant force in gaming for many years to come. It's quite sad really, as I think if any console could have migrated gamers away from Atari and averted the crash, it would have been this one. With its nice clean graphics, consistent software library and excellent pricing, it was clearly a great deal. Unfortunately the system just couldn't gain critical mass fast enough to make a difference. Sega's swan song, the Dreamcast. It only lasted a short few years, but it accomplished a lot during its short time on Earth and established itself as an innovative, unique console with a library of odd, quirky and artistic games. Games like Choo Choo Rocket, Rez and Jet Set Radio, not to mention ambitious early sandbox titles like Shenmue. There were odd hardware ideas, like the VMU, which was the Dreamcast memory card that had a little screen on it that gave each controller its own simple display, and also doubled up as a kind of handheld console and virtual pet at a time when they were all the rage. The Dreamcast got so much right, it was actually one of, if not the cheapest mainstream console at launch, but no major sacrifices had been made with the hardware. This thing was powerful in 1998 and represented absolutely phenomenal value for money, with games like Sonic Adventure and its famous whale chase scene wowing gamers when footage first started to appear, blowing away what could be seen on the N64 and PS1 at the time. Sega had learned their lessons well from their failure with the Saturn and had done everything they possibly could to try to make sure the Dreamcast would not suffer the same fate, taking in developer input on what features to include in the hardware and making sure that creating games for the Dreamcast would be as easy and painless as possible, very much taking on the ethos of the original PlayStation from the previous generation. They even made an effort to fix the dreaded television format issue in Europe by adding the option of PAL 60 to the hardware. Now, I'm not going to go into this as it will take forever, but suffice it to say, in Europe we had always had an issue with games running a little slow due to our TVs being a little different. This issue had been plaguing the territory since the very beginning of gaming, and Sega largely fixed the problem for most people with this edition. The console had a great launch lineup in the US and Europe, including the much lauded Soul Calibur, which would become one of the most respected 3D fighters ever made, and the games kept on coming thick and fast, with lots of support from Capcom especially. Strangely enough, the Dreamcast could even run some games from rival systems with the release of a third-party app called Bleemcast. Dreamcast owners could run some official PS1 games like Tekken 3, Gran Turismo 2 and even Metal Gear Solid, and they ran incredibly well to boot. This sort of thing had not been seen since the days of the ColecoVision and its dodgy 2600 add-on. More support was planned, but the company who made Bleemcast was subsequently and unsurprisingly caught up in a string of legal battles with Sony. With the Dreamcast, Sega also decided to push for online gaming as well, going as far as to include a modem in every console. Previously only the Pippin had done this, but the Pippin had not really backed this feature up with any must-have software to catch the audience's imagination. Not so with the Dreamcast, with its high-profile release of Phantasy Star Online, as well as polished PC ports of games like Quake 3 Arena and Unreal Tournament. As such, unlike the online gaming of previous consoles, many Dreamcast owners actually did decide to jump in, and the online became much more of a mainstream success than it had ever been in any console before. Online console gaming only grew from strength to strength from this point onwards, with the baton being passed to companies like Microsoft. So why did it end up going the way of the Saturn regardless? Well, I think truth be told that Sega were already past the point of no return before the console was even released. They were in too much debt and their brand name had suffered too much due to previous failures. Gamers never really gave it a chance and instead simply chose to wait for the PS2 to arrive. If I were to search for something to criticise though, it would perhaps be the controllers. Now, the analog triggers were a nice addition, especially for racing games where you were given much better control over your car's speed, and they would quite rightly be adopted by most of the other console manufacturers afterwards. But the controller itself was very toy-like in appearance and ended up being the only console of the generation to have only one analog stick. Though to be fair to Sega, when the Dreamcast was launched it was not yet clear that dual analog controls would be the future of 3D gaming. While the PS1 had dual analog controllers, they were not really being used to their full potential until quite late in the console's lifespan. In fact, GameSpot actually famously panned the dual analog control setup for first-person shooters in their review for Alien Resurrection, a game released for the PS1 in the year 2000. Previously, when the Dreamcast was being designed, it was really just being used for Ape Escape and little else. Anyway, I digress. Sadly, the Dreamcast did not manage to pull Sega out of their financial woes, and it ended up being their last console. One lucky break that did occur, though, was that the Dreamcast's copyright protection turned out to be quite insufficient for the job, which made the console perfect for the homebrew scene, and a cottage industry of unlicensed games are still being created, produced and sold to this day, and at a semi-professional level no less, keeping the console alive long after its discontinuation. Quite honestly, under the circumstances, Sega fans couldn't have hoped for a better console as a conclusion to Sega's time in the console industry. This is definitely one of the most underrated consoles among retro gaming fans, I feel, and frankly I can understand how this has come to be. There's something that just feels very bland and generic about the original Xbox and its whole look and feel, and if anything I believe this really highlights the importance of superficial factors when creating a product. The branding, aesthetics, even the name. As the Xbox really is a high quality console that had a lot of ideas incorporated into it and a very large library of imaginative and memorable games. And it really doesn't get the credit it deserves. This was Microsoft's first foray into the console market, and it was clear they really meant business. It was by far the most powerful machine of its generation, and Microsoft was willing to take a big loss on every system they sold. Initially they designed the system to be very much a premium product. Then, after realising this sort of market didn't really even exist for consoles, they'd rethought their tactics and dropped prices by the time of launch to try to get into as many homes as possible. Whilst doing this, they put tons of money into growing the software support for their new system, and even just bought some companies outright, like they did with Rare, who had been one of the superstar developers for Nintendo at the time, with games like Donkey Kong Country, GoldenEye and Banjo-Kazooie shifting very large numbers on Nintendo systems. As opposed to the position Sega were in with their ill-fated Dreamcast, for Microsoft money was absolutely no object. They knew they could take astronomical losses no problem if need be, and in the end that's exactly what they did, losing billions of dollars on the system overall. The Xbox did have some stumbles along the way. Its original controller, the Duke as it was often called, was deemed to be too large and unwieldy by most players, but it was quickly replaced by the much nicer and much smaller S controller, a pad that would be much closer to what modern ones are like these days. The software library here is really quite underrated, I feel, and is only beaten in that generation by the PS2. Due to the console's power and similarity to PC architecture, the Xbox got a lot of major PC games that would not see release on any other console of that time, and third parties like Sega and BioWare provided the system with a respectable number of exclusives too, and a much needed identity of its own. Multi-platform games were also well represented. Many of the best PS2 titles would see release on Xbox, and the majority would see improvements, not only in graphics and performance, but with the inclusion of other novel features as well. The Xbox, for instance, allowed you to quickly and intuitively rip audio from your music CDs onto your Xbox's hard drive and then use it effectively as an MP3 player, and this aspect allowed for a new feature on the console, custom soundtracks. This gave you the option of playing your own music in-game in some specific titles, such as the Grand Theft Autos and such. The hard drive, which was included in every Xbox, often made for a much smoother gameplay experience too. Lacking the memory card loading and saving screens of its competitors, the Xbox could quickly save and load with no intrusion on gameplay experience at all. In fact, the hard drive would be a staple of every subsequent console from this point on. This, coupled with the focus on online gaming inherited from the Dreamcast, with every Xbox containing its own Ethernet port as standard, would place the machine as the most forward-thinking of the console hardwares of that generation. After the lacklustre performance of the GameCube, many in the industry were beginning to write Nintendo off, positing that with the entry of major companies like Sony and now Microsoft as well into the market, Nintendo's ability to compete would be coming to an end, and as such they'd be best off just giving up on hardware and concentrating on what they were best at, making games, but just now for the consoles of rival companies. The pundits possibly would have been right if not for Nintendo making the brave decision to completely exit the tech race and sidestep the market entirely with a drastically different product. This is what they did with the Wii. Whilst the Wii's tech was an improvement over the GameCube's, it was a very modest one, being pretty much the same hardware but made to be something like 50% faster. Where the system differed from the competition was its focus on motion-controlled games, which would use a controller more akin to that of a TV remote than a normal console controller. Nintendo had come to the conclusion that a TV remote style controller would be more familiar and less threatening to non-gamers, and that motion controlled titles could bring in a new demographic to the console that could bolster Nintendo's own die-hard audience who would purchase the system just for Nintendo's classic IPs alone. They judged correctly, as the system ended up winning the whole generation with over 100 million sold. The Wii often gets a lot of derision online as a gimmicky or novelty console, but personally I don't see any real truth to this criticism, at least not outside of the odd shovelware title here and there. I always found it to be a refreshing console with a lot of charm. The unique controller gave rise to a lot of memorable, quirky games and provided the Wii with a very atypical library of titles that often gave new experiences. Even many of the sports games were quite unique. It was also well suited to family get-togethers as a party console, with the whole family passing a controller back and forth playing Wii Sports and the like. In this fashion, the Wii was able to bring in many new people who had never been interested in gaming before, as well as rekindling the passion for gaming in those who had long lost interest in the pastime. But the Wii wasn't just about motion controls. Nintendo's Avatar system, which they called Mii's, were also an excellent and fun addition, with everyone able to make their own character with their likeness, and often even use them in the games. Microsoft even ended up transparently nicking the Mii-style designs for their Xbox 360 avatars later on. We've also got the Virtual Console download service to talk about, with it bringing the burgeoning retro gaming scene into the mainstream and giving people a more legal way to enjoy the classics of gaming history. Even where new games were concerned, there was a resurgence in 2D games, with Konami creating its excellent Rebirth series, and some older style genres well suited to the Wii's unique controller also made a comeback, such as point-and-click adventures and light gun games. There were certainly some problems for the system though. The online capabilities, for example, were limited to say the least, and the hardware's weakness in comparison to its competitors and even lack of HD output meant that it was rarely home to the popular, conventional blockbuster titles of the time. In fact, reportedly the extra power the Wii had over the GameCube was rarely even used. Developers had used time-consuming programming tricks to get the most out of the GameCube, and where the Wii was concerned just chose to drop the effort in that area and use the Wii's extra power to pick up the slack, with the most impressive Wii game possibly being the truck game Zenkoku Decatora Matsuri. That's almost certainly not how it's pronounced, but you get the idea, which had high polygon counts and complicated reflection mapping. On the upside though, and it's a sad indication of the era that this can even be brought up as an advantage, the usage of older tech meant at least that the Wii was quite reliable as a console, and in fact ended up being really the only reliable console of its generation. The last thing I think is worth bringing up is the excellent homebrew scene. The Wii is a very easy console to mod, and as a result has very healthy software support to this very day. All the major online games like Mario Kart and Smash Brothers have had their previously discontinued online multiplayer features fixed and brought back into working order, and there's even the odd new game release here and there. The jewel in the Wii homebrew crown, however, has to be Mario Kart CTGP. This is a fan-made upgrade to Mario Kart Wii that adds over 200 new custom-made tracks to the game, and new options such as a 200cc mode. The online community for this game is incredibly healthy, and the tracks have just gone from strength to strength over the last decade. All in all, the Wii was a very unique and unconventional console that showed that Nintendo still had life in them yet. This very nifty little console, manufactured by the electronics giant NEC in conjunction with classic Japanese gaming company Hudson Soft, who were known for the Bomberman series, kick-started the 4th generation, appearing in Japan an entire year earlier than the Sega Mega Drive. In its original form, the Japanese PC Engine, it was a surprisingly powerful little thing with a ton of charm. Even though it was only about the size of a stack of 3 CD cases, it had no problems holding its own against later consoles like the Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. Unfortunately though, at the time a lot of stock was put into the idea of bits. The TurboGrafx-16 was only 8-bit, like the NES, its detractors would say, not like the 16-bit Mega Drive and Super Nintendo, but of course bitage is ultimately a very poor indication of hardware power. When looking at the full picture, what we had here was a console that was faster than the Super Nintendo and could put more colours on screen than the Mega Drive. It was a miniature wonder, and anyone sceptical of this should check out HuCard games like Street Fighter 2, Parodius and Bomberman 94. Its only real pitfall was the lack of background layers, causing the backgrounds to sometimes look a bit static in comparison to those of the competition. When being released in the US, the small form factor was dropped, as it was decided that such a small machine would be seen as weak and not a serious piece of kit. So the American branch padded the console out with a lot of extra plastic to beef up the size. While the price-performance ratio was phenomenal, that wasn't the most notable thing about the TurboGrafx though. No, the TurboGrafx was the first ever console to put games onto CD media. This was done through the release of an add-on in 1989 that slotted onto the machine. This addition allowed many of the improvements that would be seen in the subsequent generation right here during the 4th gen, as the capacity of the CD format allowed for full CD audio with voice-acted cutscenes and everything. So during a time when new Super Nintendo owners were raving about the quality of its music, the TurboGrafx already had in-game music that was CD quality. And of course, with this addition, the system also doubled up as a CD player, and the music playback and karaoke features were a notable advantage of the machine, as during this time most people still did not yet have access to a CD player and were still listening to their music on cassette tapes, largely because CD players were still quite expensive at the time. And what about the price? Well, though certainly more expensive to get a fully kitted out TurboGrafx than the baseline SNES and Mega Drive, it wasn't that bad, mainly due to the core system already being the cheapest of the 3 on the market and the CD add-on being highly competitively priced. Compared to the Mega Drive with CD add-on, however, there was absolutely no comparison at all, with Sega's add-on alone costing significantly more than all the TurboGrafx kit combined, and the whole package together costing close to double what you pay for the TurboGrafx. So this was a very reasonable price for what was being offered. An all-in-one system, the Turbo Duo, was also released pretty early on, and this is the most coveted model today due to its features and reliability. Games-wise, the system is a shoot-'em-up fan's dream. A huge number of them appeared on there, and the TurboGrafx was home to many of the best, such as Gate of Thunder, Spriggan and Blazing Lasers. There were also many JRPGs created, but unfortunately due to the console's limited popularity outside of Japan, many of these, such as the Far East of Eden and Legend of Xanadu series, as well as Unearthed Fantasy stories, were never translated. Thankfully there's a reason to believe this will change over time though, as there seems to be a lot of homebrew interest in fixing this problem. Fighting games were also of special note here, as games like Fatal Fury Special and World Heroes 2 were often far better than their Mega Drive and SNES counterparts, due to the CD format, which allowed the retention of more animation frames and resulted in much smoother animation. These games did however also often require a memory upgrade called the arcade card, which expanded the console's onboard memory and allowed it to actually hold all of this information. The TurboGrafx-16 was an important footnote in gaming history and often doesn't get its due credit, unfortunately not gaining much popularity in the US and not really even getting a proper release in Europe, with the only official sales here in the UK being through mail order. Which is a real shame really, as I think this was a big mistake. The Japanese PC Engine was getting a ton of positive coverage on import in our magazines back in the day, and many of its games, like R-Type and New Zealand Story, were already very big here, and I feel like there was quite a lot of hype for the machine. But alas, it was not meant to be. Still, the machine's significant success in Japan, where it actually came second, managing to even beat out the Sega Mega Drive, carried it through the generation and provided it with an excellent library of games. Nintendo's late offering into the 5th generation. The N64 was arriving 2 years after its competitors, the Saturn and PS1, but with titles like Mario 64 with its full 3D world and 360-degree analog control, which provided the ability to walk or run at a precise pace, it quickly established itself as a major contender. Now, I do feel like I'm somewhat bending my own rules in some ways here. By this stage in the list, the consoles really should have libraries that cover all genres fully, and the N64's just didn't. It's impossible to deny its weakness in RPGs and fighting games. Though some notable titles in those genres did appear, such as Paper Mario and Smash Bros., those exceptions were few and far between. One of the factors in this smaller software range was Nintendo's decision to continue with the cartridge format. N64 cartridges were more expensive to manufacture than CDs and couldn't hold as much data either. This led to N64 games being pricier than the competition, as well as them often missing the impressive full motion videos seen in big PS1 titles of the time, such as the Final Fantasies, because FMV was extremely memory hungry. Still, cartridges did have some advantages. They were more robust, for example, and more importantly could load data almost instantaneously, so at least the N64 was largely free of obtrusive load times. The reason for all of this was that Nintendo had grown very accustomed to exerting a vice-like control over their consoles over the years, and a lot of this was predicated on them controlling the software manufacturing process. As such, they were predictably very reluctant to move to a more open format. The thing with the N64 though is that many of the games it did have, and many of the choices they made in regards to the hardware, such as bringing back the Vectrex style analog thumbstick and incorporating it into the default controller, having 4 controller ports and releasing the Rumble Pack, which was unveiled to the public late in 1996. All of these ended up becoming a standard for most subsequent consoles, with Sony especially having to rush to put their own analog controller together for release 10 odd months later than Nintendo and Sega's offerings. The hardware features, whilst not created by Nintendo, had largely been forgotten about and had certainly never been utilised to their full potential. At least not outside of perhaps the occasional outlier, such as the Mega Drive's obscure XE1 controller, a controller with an analog thumbstick that was only released in Japan and was largely useless for playing anything but Afterburner 2. What Nintendo did was they saw the potential in a lot of these ideas and retried and repurposed them, and most importantly they went all in. There was no half measures here. Nintendo was resolute in their direction. The 4 controller ports were also used to great effect. A plethora of games took advantage of them, and the N64 really was the ultimate party console of its time. Games like GoldenEye, as well as Mario Kart 64 and the new N64 originals Mario Party and Smash Bros., all provided hundreds of hours of multiplayer entertainment. Games like Mario 64, Ocarina of Time, GoldenEye, and even Wave Race and Body Harvest to an extent really helped to shape the path that 3D gaming would take. 3D platformers especially may as well have not even existed prior to Mario 64's release. It had such an effect on the industry, with crude earlier games like Bug and Jumping Flash being barely recognisable to modern 3D platformers. GoldenEye was similarly influential, with an excellent split-screen deathmatch option, and even support for dual analog control in its galore control setup. The game incorporated a lot of ideas that were coming out of the PC first-person shooter modding community of the time, sniper rifles and area-specific damage and the like. The N64's game library is not that large and is very lopsided towards certain genres, but is fairly consistent in quality. There are a lot of good games here, and a few popular series got their start here as well, such as the aforementioned Smash Bros and Paper Mario, as well as the Japan-only Animal Crossing. And actually, I'd have to say it has one of the more underrated libraries of retro consoles. A few key titles just completely overshadow the rest of the system's games in the minds of most gamers. But there's a lot of good stuff here if you look for it, and whilst it's become very trendy to hate on it in recent years, I feel its importance can't credibly be denied. Microsoft kickstarted the 7th generation early when they brought out the Xbox 360, their second and arguably most memorable console, though memorable for both good and bad reasons perhaps, and the first HD console to ever be released. This was a console that was chock full of ideas released pretty early into the generation and at a very competitive price. Microsoft had learned some lessons from the public's reaction to their previous machine, putting a lot more work here into designing a sleek and stylish machine with a striking design and name. Of course, immediately afterwards they reversed this strategy and decided to instead go with endless confusing naming conventions and nondescript black cubes for all their future console designs, but again I'm digressing. Other than the look of the machine itself, they'd also taken note of the lack of Japanese third-party support for the original Xbox, especially in the RPG genre. And to make sure this didn't happen again, they invested heavily in Japanese companies and provided various incentives for third parties to release their games on the 360 first. All this groundwork resulted in a great launch lineup and a quick growth of releases that ended up providing the 360 with an absolutely huge stellar lineup of diverse titles, including many JRPGs and more niche titles like shoot 'em ups that were largely absent from the original Xbox. The earlier work that had been laid to produce recognisable IPs for the original Xbox was of course also continued, with new titles in the Halo, Fable, Forza and Project Gotham Racing series all making a welcome return on the system, with some brilliant sequels that didn't disappoint. Outside of the physical games, much focus was also put on downloadable games too, with the excellent live arcade service featuring many wild and wonderful indie games with interesting concepts that would likely never have been able to get full physical release. This service helped to bring back a plethora of 2D games and simple yet clever puzzle titles that had fallen into disrepair during the previous generation, and also provided a lifeline for smaller developers that had been pushed out of the primary market when development costs had shot through the roof, as well as a path to success for newer startups wanting to enter the market. The area where Microsoft really excelled themselves though was the system structure. Every 360 came with a wireless controller as standard, and the fully integrated Blades dashboard was phenomenally well thought out, allowing for quick navigation with messaging and cross-game chat, as well as access to your settings and music library whilst you were playing games. No longer were custom soundtracks reliant on the developer of each game choosing to add them. Due to the 360 dashboard, the feature was automatically available to all titles. Each player was also made to create a gamer profile on startup, which meant that everyone would have an online persona that kept track of their reputation, achievements and controller preferences, universally applying camera preferences such as invert look across all games for example. The aforementioned achievements were also an excellent idea and really incentivised people to master their games for the extra kudos. Microsoft really did outdo themselves in this area, and it took the competition years to catch up. And more features would also arrive with downloadable updates. In 2008, 360 owners gained access to Netflix, and player avatars also came to the console. These were essentially knockoffs of Nintendo's Mii's, but somehow were actually more limited in many ways, with the only real improvement being in regards to their outfits and accessories, which could be won in many games by accomplishing certain feats. This kind of functioned as a way to augment the achievement system, and was probably the best thing about them. The 360 was an excellent, feature-packed console with tons of great games, and, in fact, it would have actually been even higher on the list, if not for just one factor. It was shamefully unreliable. Quite possibly the most unreliable goddamn console in the entire history of gaming. This was especially true for the first couple of years before they started to get more of a handle on the infamous and ever-present Red Ring of Death, a fault that signalled the death of any 360 unfortunate enough to display it, and this ended up befalling the majority of those early models. But over time, the newer models became more and more reliable until the Jasper model arrived and largely signalled the end of the 360's unreliability issues. Had Microsoft's return policy not been as robust as it was, and they not spent $1 billion repairing and replacing all the broken consoles, I would have probably had to have dropped the system out of the top 20 entirely just due to its unreliability alone. Overall, the 360 was unequivocally the place to be during its generation for the big third-party blockbuster titles, with the majority of multi-platform games being best experienced on Microsoft's system. Sadly, it's seeming more and more unlikely as time goes on that Microsoft will ever make another console that will be able to live up to it. In a lot of ways, this was where modern gaming began. This is where everything became big business. Large teams and professional productions became the norm, with actual writers and voice actors replacing the amateurish though often charming voice acting and dodgy translations of old. Many of the major genres were now becoming established, and having that sweeping story and cinematic feel down pat pretty much became a requirement for every major game if it expected to get those rave reviews. The PS2's game library was huge, and more often than not it was the place to go for the hot games, and dominated like no console had since the days of the NES. Releases like Eco and Shadow of the Colossus, Okami and the Ratchet and Clank and God of War series had completely supplanted those of rivals like Nintendo, who had previously been the provider of some of the biggest genre-defining titles of the past, but were now largely caught on the back foot playing catch-up. It's very easy to see why the PS2 often tops people's lists of greatest consoles of all time. Personally though, I cannot however rate it higher than the original PlayStation, for reasons I'll attempt to cover here. To my mind, all of the systems in the top 7 of this list have phenomenal libraries full of more games than most could play in a lifetime, but I would say that the PS2's software library, whilst huge in number, much larger than any other console, is a little more conventional than that of the original PS1. This would perhaps be a quite contentious and arguable statement, but something I think is less arguable is that the hardware itself of the PS2 was not as innovative and forward-thinking as that of the PS1. Whilst the games library is largely without fault, I feel the actual hardware of the PS2 is kind of the opposite, and was possibly the most feature-poor of the major consoles of that generation. It was almost certainly the hardest of them to develop games for, had the fewest controller ports, support for progressive scan was the lowest of the 4, and it was the only one to not support PAL 60 in Europe either, going instead for the less compatible here but easier to implement NTSC 60, which frankly was a bit of a kick in the teeth given how popular the PlayStation brand was over here and how loyal the fan base was. Two of the consoles of that generation, the Dreamcast and Xbox, had both come with online capabilities as standard, whilst not until the Slimline model was released was this the case with the PS2. And by the time online gaming had come to the West on PS2, Dreamcast owners had been playing Phantasy Star Online and Quake 3 Arena for well over a year. Where hardware innovation was concerned, it was the original Xbox with its hard drive and custom soundtracks that feels closer to the direction the industry would take. The hard drive especially makes playing games on the Xbox a much smoother experience, with many Xbox games even auto-saving their progress and such before this would become standard. The hardware itself just did not wow me in the same way as the Dreamcast or PS1 or even the Mega Drive did when I first experienced them. Still, it must be said that the hardware, while low on features, was actually very powerful for the time and had tons of potential that was eventually tapped by more talented programmers as the generation went on, causing fully optimised PS2 games under the right circumstances, like in the case of Criterion's Burnout Revenge for example, to produce graphics that could rival and sometimes even surpass in some areas more powerful systems like the Xbox and GameCube that were released a year and a half odd later than the PS2. And it cannot be understated just how much of a success the PS2 was. It was the highest selling video game console in history, and its crown is unlikely to be lost anytime soon. The games were phenomenal and were hyper polished and forward thinking. It ended up being home to so many critical darlings, and its success also facilitated lots of memorable accessories and peripherals too. This was the console that gave us Guitar Hero, as well as things like the earlier mentioned Buzz, a quiz game where each player had their own game show style buzzer controller, and the iToy, an early attempt at providing motion-controlled games that used a small camera mounted on your television, very much like a cruder implementation of what would later become Microsoft's Kinect device. It was a massive console, and with the inclusion of DVD playback, it was also the cheapest DVD player on sale for the first few months of its lifespan, finally realising all of those dreams that so many had had back in the days of the CDI and 3DO, of providing an all-in-one multimedia console out of the box that could deal with all of your entertainment needs. Now, full disclosure, the next two consoles I consider to actually be roughly on par with each other, but given I know that awarding a draw would be viewed as an unacceptable cop-out by most people, at much protest to myself, in fifth we have the Mega Drive and in fourth the Super Nintendo. For me these are the perfect counterparts to each other, the yin and yang of gaming consoles so to speak, with one focused a little more on adventuring and RPG and puzzle aspects, and the other more on hardcore arcade experiences, shoot-em-ups, run and gun games and the like. Though make no mistake, both do have numerous examples of games of the opposing side, as both have very large libraries. I'm just talking of specialties here. The Mega Drive was by far Sega's most popular console in their portfolio, as whilst the Master System had been a success in Europe, it was the Mega Drive which finally broke Sega in the huge North American market, and they would sadly never recreate this feat again. Many consoles throughout the years prior to the Mega Drive had claimed to finally be the one to, quote, bring the arcades to the home, but as far as I'm concerned the Mega Drive was the first and finest to actually do it. I would argue, perhaps counterintuitively, that even the Neo Geo didn't quite do as good a job at capturing that feel of the grimy, murky arcade parlours of the time, due primarily to its lesser software range. Perhaps the likes of Strider and Ghouls and Ghosts did have downgraded colours in comparison to their arcade counterparts, but they still recreated the look and feel of those games admirably for the time, and at an affordable price for the consumer. The Mega Drive was the birthplace of Sonic the Hedgehog, a character that would become a gaming icon rivaling even Mario, and who would end up starring in numerous sequels and spin-offs, cartoons, and even his own series of successful movies now. And it's no wonder he became such a success, as here in his first outing he was appearing in a stunningly fast action game that was a technical showpiece for the time and a killer app for the Mega Drive that wowed gamers when first released in 1991. There was nothing else like it at the time. The role of pushing the system was then passed on to Japanese companies like Treasure, who brought some of the craziest and most impressive run and gun games of the era to the system, showing the speed advantage of the Mega Drive hardware in comparison to its competitors in all its glory. The Mega Drive was a joy for anyone who wanted exciting, balls-to-the-wall action games, but it was also a leader with real-time strategy games as well, with titles like Herzog's Way and ports of important computer releases like Dune 2 and Megalomania gracing the system. Not to mention the Japan-only Advanced Dyson Ryaku, which I've probably butchered the title of, which actually had a fully functional competitive online multiplayer in Japan. In fact, the Mega Drive seems to have been the first console to have online multiplayer functionality, period, through its Mega Modem add-on. Prior consoles had gone online before for sure, all the way back to the old Intellivision and Atari 2600, but previously they had been limited to downloading simple games or extra content, never to connect with another player to play competitively over the internet. Sega's willingness to always experiment with add-ons and new hardware was one of their more interesting qualities, but also an aspect which largely ended up helping to lead to their downfall, with their many failures piling up and hurting their brand name as the years progressed. And as an aside, about the infamous add-ons, the Mega CD, which allowed the console to play CD games and music CDs, and the 32X, which improved the hardware capabilities to be able to handle 3D polygon graphics. If anyone's wondering about whether they affected the Mega Drive's placing on the list, I did put some thought into this. The problem being that if I'm including the PC Engine's CD add-on, then I have to include the Mega CD in the Mega Drive entry too for consistency, right? This created an issue for me for a while, but eventually I came to the conclusion that they don't really actually make much difference anyway, as all in all I feel that any gains the Mega Drive makes in added software from including those add-ons is offset by the added hardware costs. Unlike the situation with the PC Engine and its CD unit, this stuff was really expensive, and those gains made from including the CD titles in the Mega Drive's entry are in nowhere near the same scale as the PC Engines. Anyway, in closing, the Mega Drive was a powerful and exciting system for its time, and at no other stage in gaming has there been a closer competition between two consoles, with the Mega Drive and SNES competing neck and neck against each other in North America for pretty much the whole generation. The Super Nintendo, one of the clear fan favourites of the retro community. Confident in their position as market leader in the world of video gaming, Nintendo waited 7 years to release their much anticipated successor to the Famicom, but when the console did arrive it did not disappoint. It was a nice looking machine, well in Japan and Europe it was anyway, with sequels to all of the beloved NES classics. Mario, Zelda, Metroid, Mega Man, Castlevania and many others appeared thick and fast, and they were bigger and better than ever. The controller was improved with a slightly more ergonomic design, including a new diamond button layout and side buttons, which had not been seen since the times of the video game Crash, but would from now on be a stalwart feature of most controllers going forward. And it featured a solid hardware design too, with the system's ability to rotate and scale the background, usually just referred to as Mode 7 for the sake of brevity here, being the primary positive. Now sure, the Mode 7 was often just used as a gimmick, but in other areas, such as with racing games especially, it provided a very real advantage that allowed the Super Nintendo to dominate the competition. Instead of driving down endless straights which alternated between the odd curving left and curving right, which was the typical racing setup of the time for rival consoles, using Mode 7 the SNES could actually do more complex, proper courses with U-turns and smooth 360-degree panning. To highlight this feature of the hardware, Nintendo also created two of what would become their biggest racing franchises, F-Zero and Mario Kart. The rotation and scaling features were also useful in other areas. With clever tricks we got to see epic bosses seemingly rotating and scaling around the screen, and in JRPGs we got to fly over and explore huge landscapes in games like Secret of Mana and the Final Fantasy titles. The SNES's impressive colour usage and palette for the time was also a big boon for JRPGs, creating beautiful environments that would contain phenomenal Japanese pixel art that would often put the JRPG efforts on rival systems to shame. And what JRPGs they were! The Japanese output for the genre took an absolutely huge leap forwards here. JRPGs really came into their own and discovered their identity, starting to really differentiate themselves from traditional Western RPGs. with sprawling worlds and unwinding plot lines and narratives of the like not seen before in gaming. The SNES really was an RPG powerhouse, especially in Japan where a number of games unfortunately never left. Those reams of character dialogue were just too much of an expensive undertaking to translate into English back in the day, in an era when JRPGs were still quite niche here in the West. Another thing we saw was a big expansion in the prevalence of games that featured battery-backed saves. These had existed during the days of the NES and Master System, but here with the SNES this started to gain a lot more ground. We saw the industry really starting to move away from the old ways of constantly forcing the player to restart every time they put on a game, playing through from beginning to end in one sitting on a set number of lives, and more towards the modern system of longer games that let you quickly and easily continue from where you left off, leading to deeper and more involving quests. It wasn't all sunshines and rainbows though. Flushed with the success of the NES, Nintendo went into the 16-bit era quite overconfident, leading to the machine being perhaps a little bit too late to the party for its own good, and giving Sega enough time to make some major inroads into the market. For a number of different reasons, the hardware was also quite slow overall, which led to the SNES occasionally struggling with the more intense action games in comparison to its two rivals. And there would also be an issue with censorship, with Nintendo's Western branches somewhat still being of the mindset that gaming was primarily a children's pastime, which led to the infamous SNES version of Mortal Kombat, a port of the popular arcade game which had made a name for itself for being gruesome and bloody, but in which the SNES version had replaced the blood with sweat and nerfed all of the finishing moves. This was mainly the doing of Nintendo of America though. Back in Japan, the SNES would always be supplied with a steady supply of horror games throughout its lifespan. In fact, after losing ground to the Mega Drive and its version of Mortal Kombat, Nintendo of America also dropped their own stance on video game violence like a ton of bricks, and Mortal Kombat sequels would subsequently be uncensored on the system, just like the Mega Drive versions. The Super Nintendo was a fantastic machine, and it also managed to age pretty gracefully as well. As we moved into the early 5th generation and saw new 3D consoles arriving, Nintendo released 3D titles for the SNES too, like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX. These games included a support chip in the cartridge called the Super FX chip. They were a product of a meeting between Nintendo and the UK company Argonaut, who had been working on a 3D title for the original Game Boy. Nintendo had been so impressed with what they saw that they brought Argonaut staff to Japan to help teach them how to get to grips with the development of 3D polygonal graphics. And the two ended up producing the Super FX chip together, a chip which was put into Super Nintendo cartridges in order to expand the capabilities of the console and provide simplistic 3D graphics. Second-party companies like Rare also managed to help keep interest in the Super Nintendo going by using advanced silicon graphics workstations to make their games Donkey Kong Country and Killer Instinct, and it was with the release of these titles that the SNES finally managed to equalise and pass the Mega Drive, or Sega Genesis as it was known there, in the United States. Though the Super Nintendo never pulled this off in Europe, where the Mega Drive continued to reign supreme. And now, well, the system's colourful graphics, attractive pixel art and focus on 2D games means that it still looks fantastic to this day. The Atari 2600, or Atari VCS as it was originally called, was the first ever console to gain mass market popularity and fully enter into the public's consciousness, the first to gain a large library of memorable games, and the console which to many represents the very genesis of gaming. It was an introduction to the media for so many of the people who would become die-hard fans from this point on. In fact, I myself first experienced gaming on one of these things. I was too young to have experienced the 2600 when it was new, of course, but my family had bought one the year I was born, and as a young child it was the only console I had access to. Playing games like Galaxian and Pac-Man were my first tastes of video gaming before I was old enough to ask for a games console of my own. The hardware here is insanely crude by today's standards, but also kind of genius in some respects. The 2600 was actually even cruder than it first seems. I, for example, never realised as a kid that programmers could only design the left-hand side of the background. Without the use of programming tricks, the right-hand side has to be either a mirror image or a copy of the left-hand side. The hardware was truly only ever really designed to play games like Pong and Tank. However, regardless of these restrictions, the 2600's design was very, very open, so open that programs were able to achieve far and away more than was envisioned back when it was being designed, leading to it ably surpassing all of its contemporaries and even resulting in passable ports of games like Kung Fu Master 10 years after it had been released. You wouldn't think it now, but the Atari 2600 had a surprisingly slow start. It probably didn't help that the console was pretty expensive at launch, and it took a good while for the prices to drop, but all of this turned around when the excellent home port of Space Invaders arrived. Space Invaders had been a massive hit in the arcades, and everyone just had to own a copy of it of their own for the home. This was when the 2600 really started to take off into the stratosphere, and from this point on it just went from strength to strength, with huge numbers of classic games gaining release, and later games like Pitfall and River Raid representing the genesis of platform games and scrolling shooters. Unfortunately, as is often the case with companies that achieve such meteoric rise, over time Atari started to rest on their laurels. Their disrespect to many of their own programmers led to an exodus of some of their most talented staff and the creation of Activision, who would start competing with Atari for software sales on the console as the first ever third-party company. Then after this, matters went from bad to worse, as the lack of quality control and glut of shovelware being released on the 2600, including Atari's own overproduced, risible EZ tie-in, was a major factor in causing the North American video game crash. Remember, these games were expensive. ET may have come out for around $30 in 1983, but that is the equivalent of somewhere around $100 in today's money when taking into account inflation. These games were not cheap. Well, before the crash they were not cheap anyway. After the crash, however, 2600 games were piled into clearance baskets across America. Even with the situation being as dire as it was, the Atari 2600 would remain in production all the way up until 1992, a little after 15 years after it had been launched. The 2600 was a footnote in gaming history and a huge success, and it arguably dominated its generation in a way that no other console had managed to do to quite the same level. Unfortunately, Atari would never really manage to recreate this success in the console world, not even really a small fraction of this success to be honest, becoming more and more irrelevant as time went on and slowly having their company broken down into segments and then passed around from new owner to new owner. Still, their mark on gaming will never be forgotten. It honestly took me no time at all to decide on my pick as the best retro Sony console, such was my certainty on the matter. And here it is, the original PlayStation. This was Sony's first attempt at releasing a home console, and astonishingly for a newcomer they got pretty much everything right. The hardware direction, the price, the software support, the ease of development, the marketing, aesthetics and style of the machine, everything was right on the money. Sony positioned this as the hot product to own of the time, and they also successfully marketed the machine to a new, older and trendier demographic, resulting in the PS1 doing a lot to destigmatise gaming and make it an integral part of the prevailing culture. They did this largely through savvy marketing and licensing deals, such as when real licensed music was included in popular games like Wipeout. And while we're on the subject of Wipeout, this was a game that was made by a company called Psygnosis, who were a major British developer and publisher on computers back in the day. Sony had bought a stake in the company prior to releasing the PlayStation and had tasked them, along with SN Systems, with creating the PS1's development environment, with the goal to make it as friendly to developers as possible. And Psygnosis excelled themselves, doing a phenomenal job with their development kit, which they named PsyQ, creating a powerful and easy to use environment for third-party support that assuredly must have resulted in the console gaining a larger and faster level of third-party uptake. Apart from all these excellently judged moves in regards to marketing, hardware and development tools though, the system just had an absolutely huge library of interesting and unique games. There really is something for everyone here. The industry during the PS1 era was not quite the commercialised big business monster it would become during the PS2 era yet, with smaller companies still providing the PlayStation with a lot of eclectic and unique games and concepts, bolstering a large library of AAA titles from all the biggest third-party companies in gaming. On top of Sony going the extra mile in making sure the system provided the easiest development environment for programmers, they'd also invested in making lucrative deals with many third-party companies, many of whom were perhaps not quite reaching their full potential at the time. I mean, who's to know what the status of JRPGs would be like in the West today, if not for Sony piling so much money into Final Fantasy VII's Western release back then. Previously, JRPGs had never really reached the level of popularity outside of Japan that they had in their own home country, and half the time they were never even released in Europe at all, even the major ones. After the release of Final Fantasy VII, however, this would rarely be a problem ever again. Many of the games that would gain popularity on the PS1 would end up becoming so big that they would dictate where the audience would go for subsequent consoles. Sequels to games like Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo, Resident Evil and Tekken would be major factors in buying decisions going forward, and arguably would decide the victor in some of the coming generations in some cases before they'd even begun. We also saw what is arguably Sony's biggest contribution to the gaming industry here with the release of the dual analog controller and its inclusion of a second analog stick. This would end up creating an industry standard, with most subsequent consoles following suit and using this second stick for camera control. The only real black mark against the PS1 software library is in regards to Sony's treatment of 2D games. Strictly speaking, Sony of America's treatment of 2D games, with them seemingly being dead set on blocking the release of many good 2D titles from Japan. Now, I'm under no illusions, a lot of these games likely wouldn't have sold stellar amounts anyway, due to the 3D obsessed spirit of the times, but it would have been nice to have had the choice, especially given how fantastic the PS1's 2D library was over in Japan, where many excellent 2D bullet hell shooters, fighters and platformers had seen release. Games like Silhouette Mirage, Panzer Bandit, Dominated Mind and the Donpachi games were some really nice 2D PS1 releases that were left to languish in their home country. This anti-2D stance taken on by Sony USA would reportedly cause a lot of problems between Sony and some of the Japanese third-party developers, such as Capcom, who were a company who still had a lot of focus on 2D development at the time. And this quarrel would even have some repercussions for the next generation, before ultimately getting resolved. All in all, it has to be said that this was an absolutely phenomenal console, and in retrospect, I just find it very surprising that during a time where there was so much uncertainty and turbulence in the gaming industry, the company with the least experience had the clearest idea of the direction that the market was going in. Perhaps it was because they had the least preconceived notions about gaming, or maybe they just did a hell of a lot more market research than anyone else did. Regardless, they played a blinder. So the number one spot has to go to the NES, my favourite console of all time. This was the first time I remember where the games really caught my imagination. They had memorable characters going on adventures through rich worlds and fighting against memorable adversaries. Previous games had gaming characters, of course. The eternally hungry Pac-Man and the Lego Brickman Pitfall Harry spring to mind. But let's be honest, nobody was caught up in the high drama of Pac-Man. Though of course the narratives of these NES games were very simple by today's standards themselves, and people may, perhaps quite rightly, scoff at the suggestion that the world building of NES games should be characterised in such an enthusiastic light. But regardless, it can't be denied that the characters, worlds and even soundtracks of NES games resulted in a plethora of franchises that are still hugely popular to this day. I do have to scale back a little though and make sure I don't get too carried away. Inroads in this area had already been made, but this was on computers as opposed to consoles. Before Link had set foot in Hyrule, Luxor and his band had explored the land of midnight, and Professor Atombender had directly threatened the player with destruction. But what the NES did was bring these advances to consoles and imbue them with console sensibilities like accessibility and immediacy. Not only were the games easier to use, they were easier to play too, and often had polish, consistency and quality of life improvements over their computer counterparts. And Nintendo had its seal of quality too, which assured a minimum set of standards. Sure, the standards could be quite low at times, but the NES at least was largely free from the plethora of catastrophically buggy and oftentimes literally impossible games that graced the computers of the time. Games like Zelda, Metroid and Super Mario Bros. Were hugely influential in the history of gaming, and yeah, in some respects they were standing on the shoulders of giants, with them also taking a lot of their best aspects from emerging ideas in many arcade and computer games of the time, but they succeeded in being far more than the sum of their parts, combining many ideas into a more polished and cohesive experience. And Nintendo playtested the heck out of those games as well to provide much smoother gameplay with more precise controls. And where the controls are concerned, well, the NES had a pretty excellent controller for its time that was leagues ahead of the competition. Controllers like the Intellivision, ColecoVision and 5200s were often imprecise, overcomplicated and actually just plain difficult to even hold and use for extended periods of time in general. The NES joypad took the best elements of earlier control methods, the D-pad from Nintendo's own Game & Watches, which was a kind of evolution on the Intellivision's disc pad, and the pause button from the 5200, and they added a sufficient though not excessive number of buttons for what was required and then put them into an easy to hold rectangle block. The D-pad especially was just so much more precise than earlier controllers where it came to 2D games, and would be a staple of controllers from this point on. The hardware of the NES was generally actually quite powerful for the time when originally released in Japan in 1983, being on par with the more advanced computers for a couple of years where it came to playing games, and even including a pretty nice sound chip too. It was a very efficient, well-rounded and well thought out design that could be sold at a competitive price and which could do a fine job of handling the types of games that were popular during the era. A lot of what would become the standard structure in the gaming market would also be established here, with the NES being sold at a loss and money being made back on the software, bolstered with royalties collected from third-party games companies who would be given license to create games for the console, if, and it's a big if, they followed Nintendo's rules. And boy did Nintendo leverage their position as market leader when writing up said rules, carrying out a lot of what can only be described as strong-arm tactics. The set of rules that Nintendo laid out would be honestly pretty brutal and would end up garnering them some much warranted criticism. Companies producing games for the machine were limited to only a set number of releases per year. They had to follow a bunch of censorship guidelines about violence and religious imagery, and most notorious of all, would have to commit to their titles being exclusive to the NES for 2 years, a policy that would land Nintendo in hot water with the law as an anti-competitive practice later on. Going back to the beginning, as has been mentioned earlier in the list, the US went through a video game crash in 1983, and afterwards it was believed in that territory that gaming had been a fad that had now come to an end. While this was going on in the US, however, gaming was actually pretty healthy in Europe, where consumers had moved to computers, and Japan, where the lull in console gaming had never happened and things were really only just starting to get going. Nintendo were able to build up their strength in Japan and then gain the confidence to release the system in the United States, to much resistance from retailers at first, who were wary to commit to gaming again after such losses in the past. Nintendo made a lot of funny changes to try to distance the NES from being perceived as a games console, calling it an entertainment system and its cartridges game packs, as well as converting it to being a front-loading mechanism, hoping to bring to mind thoughts of VCRs and such in the minds of consumers. All of these changes would be dropped for later consoles, so it's hard to know just how important they really were. But regardless, the NES got into retail and became a huge phenomenon in the US, leading to a resurgence and recovery of the video game market in that territory on the wave of Super Mario Bros. Popularity. Not to say that the NES, quote, saved video gaming, as many have liked to claim over the years. It was bound to recover in the US eventually anyway, but who knows what form it would have taken or how long if it hadn't been for Nintendo. The NES, like the prior two consoles on this list, was a major footnote in the advancement of gaming that had countless timeless classics and will probably remain my favourite console for the rest of my days. So that's the end of the video. Hope you enjoyed it. It took a lot of effort. What follows is a list of all of the excellent YouTubers who helped me to get footage for the montages. Without their help, this would have been a much lesser video. Links to all of their channels can be found in the description. Pay them a visit. If you feel like supporting the creation of more videos like this, then there's a link to our Patreon in the description.